They childhood friends that fell hard for each other.
He just swept her off her feet and she fell in love with him.
A devoted mother and a military man with 3 beautiful children.
They seem to be living a typical American dream lifestyle.
But just when it seemed their happy lives were complete, a brutal murder rips their world apart.
But something had to have gone horribly wrong for this scenario to emerge.
As detectives dig into the investigation, they discover a sinister plot.
The allegations that were being made floored me, that somebody would do something like that.
When we found out who it was just shocking.
The web of lies so tangled, it leaves everyone wondering if they'll ever know the truth.
And there were just all of these layers to this.
Now we're trying to figure out, okay, how does all this come together?
Nothing was adding up.
Everything just kept pulling us in more and more. What's really going on here?
Monday, October 26, 2009. All is quiet in Logan Square, a charming neighborhood on Chicago's North Side. But that evening, 911 receives a call from this peaceful pocket of the Windy City.
This is 911. You need police or fire? I'm not sure.
The caller identifies himself as Darren Brewer, and he's concerned about his 22-year-old wife, Kenya Tay. Darren says she disappeared late Sunday night.
Did you try to contact her by phone?
Yes, me, her mom, dad, and sister been calling her all day and texting, and no response.
Darren hasn't heard from Kenya Tay, but he tells the 911 operator that he's found something that could help police track her down.
And as we driving, we see my car in the alley.
Okay, one that she drives all the time?
Yes.
Oh, okay. What type of vehicle is it?
It's a 2001 Chevy.
Okay, we're going to send the police. Belden and Kildare, correct?
Yes, ma'am.
As police head to Logan Square to check things out, Darren waits for word about his beloved wife. But no one could imagine just how dark and twisted this troubling case was about to get. Kenya Tay Collier Brewer was a born and bred Chicago girl. The oldest of 3 siblings, she always stood out in a crowd, even at a young age.
Kenya Tay, she just had a great heart. She loved to smile. She just loved to have fun. Kenya Tay was a very bright student, inquisitive growing up. She was very outgoing.
But Kenya Tay wasn't just smart. She was blessed with brains and beauty.
Oh yeah, all the boys liked her. She was not a big flirt, but everyone told her how pretty she was.
And with every good-looking young man in her neighborhood trying their best to get with her, Kenya Tay sometimes found it hard to hold out for Mr. Right. By the time she was 18, she was pregnant with her first child.
I remember when she first had her first son, how happy she was and excited she was. And she just wanted to be a really good mother.
The second she began having children, she became very serious about it. Going back to school, studying nursing, graduating with honors.
After graduating, Kenya Tay began working as a nurse's assistant and had high hopes of making a career out of doing something she loved.
She just loved helping people. She loved working with the elderly.
By 2006, everything was coming together for this bright young woman. But she also wanted the right man by her side.
Kenya?
Darren, hi.
Hey.
Turns out, he had been hiding in plain sight.
Actually knew Darren Brewer from early in her childhood.
And when their paths crossed again in adulthood, the chemistry was undeniable.
They had known each other for such a long time. There was that belief that they were meant to be together.
I'm definitely gonna call you.
He just swept her off her feet and she fell in love with him.
Like Kenya Tay, fellow Chicago native Darren Brewer was smart and ambitious.
He had a pretty big personality. He seemed to be an intelligent person.
He was making a name for himself. He had a nice job at the Illinois National Guard.
It didn't take long for Kenya Tay to realize she wanted to spend her life with Darren.
It was kind of a whirlwind romance by all accounts. Some people fall in love, in a few months and they get married and they live happily ever after.
Her and Darren were very young and they got married. She just wanted to really complete her life.
Before long, that life included 2 more kids of their own. Both at the young age of 22, Kenya Tay and Darren seemed to have it all.
She had married the man of her dreams, man in uniform, that was helping her with her first son, and they had 2 other beautiful children. She also had a good job. She was continuing her education, so she felt that she was living out her dreams.
Which makes it all the more surprising when Kenya Tay goes missing one Sunday night in October of 2009. Early the next morning, Darren reaches out to friends and family for help.
Hello? Have you heard from Kenya?
No, I haven't talked to her today.
When we made contact with Darren, he said that they had a normal evening. Kenya Tay came in from work, put the kids down. He was tired, was going to bed.
And she went out with a couple friends.
He sent her a text message asking her to bring back milk. He got no response. He went to sleep, woke up, and she still wasn't home.
We started to panic, so we felt that it was time for the authorities to get involved.
8 hours into Kenya Tay's disappearance, Darren contacts police,
I'd like to report a missing person.
but is told he'd have to wait a few more hours before he can file a missing persons report.
Police often tell people to wait 24 hours to report someone missing to make sure they actually are missing. It could be a false alarm.
Left with few options, Darren holds out hope that his wife would soon turn up. But that evening, after picking up their kids from daycare, Darren spots something chilling along his drive home.
He discovers his wife's vehicle parked unattended in an alley. That's when he makes a 911 call.
With 3 small children in the car, Darren decides it's best not to stop and examine his wife's car. Instead, he drives the short distance home and waits for law enforcement to search the vehicle.
When the police first arrived at the car, there was nothing unusual. There was no damage to the car, and there was no one inside.
Unlocked.
The doors were unlocked. They searched the inside of the vehicle, and they didn't find anything.
But moments later, everything changes.
One of the officers pressed the trunk release button. The other officer at the rear of the vehicle at that time made a gruesome discovery.
There was a woman's body stuffed inside. She was wearing a nurse's uniform. She had blood covering her head. She was clearly deceased.
She still had her name tag on, so they knew it was Darren's wife, Kenya Tay Brewer.
So now, at this point, the missing persons case has turned into a homicide.
Why would someone kill this popular, attractive young woman who seemingly had everything going for her? Just didn't make sense.
What investigators don't realize is that Kenya Tay's mysterious death is about to open a Pandora's box of deception and greed, the horrific likes of which no one will ever forget.
Everyone has been shocked, hoping that it was still not true.
Devoted couple Darren Brewer and Kenya Tay Collier Brewer had promising careers, a loving marriage, and a happy home with 3 adorable children.
They seem to be living the typical American dream lifestyle. He was a nice-looking fellow employed with the Illinois National Guard in service to his country, and she was a nurse's assistant.
But all that changed on October 26, 2009. After having gone missing, Kenya Tay is found dead in the trunk of her own car in the northwest side of Chicago.
Kenya Tay is church-going, loving mother and wife, not the person that you would expect to end up in this situation.
How does a lady like her end up in the back of a trunk?
At the crime scene, detectives try to find some answers to this mystery.
What we got?
Investigators were called to the scene. They were trying to figure out what happened, what was going on.
They're looking at the body, and it's obvious that Kenya Tay has been shot in the head. Her body is then removed to confirm her cause of death and hopefully to find some evidence that can be linked back to the killer.
Unfortunately, the scene provides few clues as to how Kenya Tay ended up there.
You're looking for a shell casing from the bullet. You're looking for a gun. You're looking for a shoe, a glove, anything that would give you an idea of who the suspect was.
Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Nothing seemed out of place. There were no clues as to say what happened, what led up to this.
Without hard evidence, detectives must consider all possibilities.
Was it a robbery gone bad? Was it a simple carjacking? Did the crime happen here? Or was her body dumped here?
Robberies and carjackings are crimes of opportunity, and the people that perpetrate those crimes, generally they select likely victims. She would have probably been an appealing target with a nurse's uniform, small build, 5'2", 130 pounds. That had to be considered.
But as police know, a deadly robbery would be highly unusual in the quiet Logan Square neighborhood.
Carjackings, robberies, things of that nature in that particular area don't happen with any high frequency at all. Crime scene tape in this neighborhood was a big deal. A canvass was conducted. That's standard, that anybody see anything, hear anything.
While CSIs continue to process the scene, detectives are left with the grim task of informing Kenyatay's husband, Darren, of his wife's death.
We've identified the body of your deceased wife.
You can't imagine that someone would hurt her. Not his caring wife, not the woman that everyone loved. He just can't imagine that someone would want to hurt her like this.
We are sorry for your loss.
Detectives have no reason to suspect Darren had anything to do with his wife's death. But maybe Darren can help them track down the killer.
Did your wife have any enemies?
Was there previous history of violence? Does she have a criminal background? Does she live a high-risk lifestyle?
Darren is positive Kenyate wasn't involved in any illegal activity. But he then says something startling.
There was this one incident last year.
Approximately a year earlier, Kenyate was exiting the residence along with her husband, Darren. She actually sustained a gunshot while she was 6 months pregnant. And in fact, her husband had also sustained a less serious injury as well.
Anything ever developed from that?
No, sir.
Was there anything else that's ever happened?
A few weeks before her murder, she was cut in the face with a bottle. Someone threw a bottle at her while she was in the car.
They were sitting at a stoplight, and all of a sudden, here comes this bottle flying through the window and cut her face.
Initially, it seemed the attacks on Kenyate were random and unrelated. But now, detectives wonder if they are somehow connected to our murder.
Give us a call if there's anything else you can think of.
Detectives obviously had to take them into consideration if there was some type of a ongoing threat to her person.
If someone has been attacked and then turns up dead, it seems as though this may not be a random act of violence. Detectives have to ask themselves then if someone is out to get her.
It seems impossible that this devoted mother and nurse's assistant could have any enemies whatsoever. But detectives are about to learn that a shocking secret may have sparked a vicious act of retribution.
The lies and jealousy and the betrayal is unreal.
And Kenyate Collier Brewer and their 3 kids had a picture-perfect life together. But that fairy tale was shattered when Kenyate was found shot dead in the trunk of her own car.
This young woman who was bursting with energy was gone, and now there's this void. In one fell swoop, the mother's gone, and now these children are motherless.
The family was grieving, but then also there's her husband, Darren. He's grieving. He's lost his wife, the mother of his kids.
They were reeling, just totally reeling, trying to make sense of all of it.
Meanwhile, detectives are trying to figure out if Kenyate had been specifically targeted. Darren tells them she had been the victim of 2 violent crimes over the past year.
It starts to look like someone is actually out to hurt her, that she's not just a random victim.
The second attack on Kenyate left severe cuts to her face. The detectives have to ask then, could this be more personal?
Investigators need to learn more about their victim, so they go to her family. Like husband Darren, they're still overwhelmed by Kenyate's death.
Our worst nightmare had come true.
She worked hard. She didn't do any drugs. She took care of her family. She did a lot of family-oriented activities.
When she left work, did someone follow her? Did the car break down? Our minds was just racing and just really could not come to grips with still who could have done this to her.
With the family at a loss for an explanation, and with police finding no suspects in the first 2 attacks, the investigation seems to have hit a dead end. That is, until police ask about Kenyate and Darren's relationship.
They had a good relationship. Darren was very good with the kids.
Darren Brewer looked like a family man. He was in the military. He expected to be deployed out to Afghanistan.
But all was not well in paradise.
When you say appeared to be the perfect couple, could you elaborate?
The family has learned that Darren has been keeping a deep, dark secret.
He was having an affair.
He's got another lover.
With whom?
It was a man.
Darren had been in the closet and in denial about his sexual orientation, but it got to the point where he just couldn't deny it anymore. Darren was gay and was having an affair.
It was still somewhat shocking to some of the family members and maybe to Kenya Tay as well that the affair he was having was in fact with a man.
But apparently, Darren had no intention of leaving his wife.
He has this polished image. I have a wife, I have kids that I love. So no one can find out about this. No one can find out how he's been living a double life.
He had a military career at risk. He had this, at least on paper, little family unit that he was trying to maintain for appearances.
According to Kenya Tay's family, even after she discovered Darren's secret life, the couple continued to live together. But Kenya Tay became increasingly unhappy while Darren sought comfort in the arms of his male lover.
Once you start hearing those details, all it just leaves you with more and more questions. And everything just kept pulling us in more and more. Like, what's really going on here?
The family is now wondering if this has something to do with Kenya Tay's death.
In speaking to Kenya Tay's family, detectives learned the man Darren has been seeing is named Joseph Matthews.
When detectives determine that someone is having an affair, it raises all sorts of questions.
That's a pretty big moment, because now you've got what you think is some sort of motive.
If Darren doesn't want to get a divorce because he doesn't want to put his career at risk, that could have caused problems for Darren's boyfriend. Detectives have to consider whether Darren's boyfriend wanted to end the marriage at any cost.
There's only one way to find out. Detectives must find Darren's boyfriend.
He's become involved in this now, whether he wants to be or not.
On the evening of October 26, 2009, police track down Joseph Matthews and bring him in for questioning.
Have a seat here.
Detectives immediately confront him about his relationship with Darren.
How long have you known each other?
I've known him since May.
Were you intimate?
Yes, we were.
Joseph is forthcoming about his relationship with Darren, and when the conversation turns to Kenya Tay, Joseph makes a startling admission.
I knew they had kids, but Darren never told me he was married.
Not only does Joseph deny harboring any ill will towards Kenya Tay, he seems genuinely upset about her death. Still, detectives are curious about his whereabouts on the night of October 25th. According to Joseph, while he admits that he saw Darren earlier that evening, he was at home, in bed, at the time of the crime.
Anyone see you?
Yeah, my roommates.
You have a number we can call?
Yeah.
Detectives speak to Joseph's roommates and ultimately verify his alibi. At that point, they have no choice but to cut him loose. With their primary suspect all but eliminated, police can't help but wonder, if Joseph didn't kill Kenya Tay, then who did? Before detectives can consider their next move, they get a surprising new lead.
Darren comes to the police with a bombshell.
What can you tell us, Darren?
I know who killed my wife.
Who?
It was my brother.
He named his brother Dewan as being the gunman who actually shot and killed Kenya Tay.
Police are stunned. Darren has just identified his wife's killer. But why would Darren's brother Dewan want to kill Kenya Tay? According to Darren, Kenya Tay came to him a few weeks earlier with a disturbing allegation.
Kenya Tay tells her husband that in fact his brother came over and forcibly raped her.
Darren confronted his brother, but his brother said that it was not a rape.
He said it was consensual.
She was not that type of a person. She loved her husband. She loved her kids. So I find it very hard to believe that she consented to have sex with him, period.
According to Darren, if the sex wasn't consensual, then Dewan had ample motive to murder Kenyete.
Darren thinks that he may have killed Kenyete to keep her quiet.
It's a stunning accusation, but police are curious why Darren waited so long to tell them.
He's my brother.
He says he didn't say anything at first because it was his brother, but now he's afraid for his and his children's safety.
This, of course, is a huge development in the case.
Do you know where your brother is?
He's at his girlfriend's house.
We're gonna need an address.
Darren tells police that Dewan has been staying with his girlfriend and gives them the address. They go to the house. Police think they're about to get their suspect.
Is Mr. Poe on the premises right now?
He's nowhere to be found.
They make contact with the girlfriend at location, and in short order, she gives them a consent to search.
Go ahead, guys.
They scour the apartment, and between two mattresses, they find a .380 semi-automatic pistol.
Detective.
The gun is the same caliber as the bullet recovered from Kenyete's body.
I have a gun.
Police are hot on his trail, and he's nice enough to leave a murder weapon right there, you know, where he laid his head.
At this point in the investigations, the detectives have a motive. They have the weapon. They just need to find the suspect.
But just when it appears they are on the verge of solving the case, detectives get a tip that changes everything.
It's definitely an onion where layers are being peeled back. What are we going to find out now about this case?
Kenyete Collier Brewer, a beautiful mother of 3, was discovered dead, stuffed in the trunk of her car. The crime itself was shocking enough. But investigators were even more surprised to learn that Kenyete's husband, Darren, was having an affair with another man. But during his interrogation, Darren named his own brother, Dewan Poe, as the killer.
When Darren comes forward and points the finger at his brother, this is a huge development in the case. The murder suspect has landed in their laps, and it changes the whole course of the investigation.
Darren says he thinks Dewan killed her to keep her quiet about an alleged rape Dewan committed against Kenyete.
The motivation came along with the fear that Kenyete might accuse him of rape.
A search of Dewan's girlfriend's apartment turns up the murder weapon. All detectives need to do now is find Dewan Poe. Police fan out in search of Dewan and soon hit pay dirt. A local gas station attendant claims he may know something about the case.
In police work, there is no bad lead. Some may be a dead end, some may turn out to be actually good.
Police drive to the south side of Chicago, more than 15 miles away from where Kenyete was discovered. At the gas station, an employee describes an incident that took place the night Kenyete disappeared.
The other night, I'm working the register.
The gas station attendant tells detectives that when he was working Sunday night, he heard a woman scream.
So I look outside and I see a couple standing there.
And there was another man wearing a mask that looked like he had a gun.
So he puts the man in the driver's seat and the woman in the passenger seat.
Get in the car and drive!
And then he himself gets in the vehicle and they speed away.
The attendant tells police he reported the incident, but detectives will need more information in order to determine if it was connected to Kenyete's murder.
Did you see what color the car was?
It was blue.
Kenyete's car was indeed blue, but that doesn't necessarily mean it was the one used in the carjacking witnessed by the attendant.
You have camera surveillance here too, right?
Yeah, I've got them everywhere.
If you don't care, could we have a look at that?
Hey, sure. Come on back.
It was private surveillance video that really showed everything.
Specifically, the video shows Darren and Kenyete at the gas station together.
Detectives watch the video and see Darren and Kenyete pull into the gas station.
That shows the vehicle that Kenyete was later discovered murdered in.
The video also shows Darren and Kenyete's children sitting in the back seat of the car.
Then a masked gunman appears in the footage.
Is it possible Darren and Kenyete were carjacked, and that's how Kenyete ended up dead? Detectives mull this over as they watch the surveillance video. That's when they notice something very peculiar.
What's he doing in the trunk?
Before Darren gets back into the car, he goes to the trunk and rearranges some things around.
Yeah, that's odd.
Can you pause that right there?
Yes, sir. This is the same trunk where Kenyate's body was found less than 24 hours later. That's suspicious.
The surveillance footage raises a bunch of questions. Why didn't Darren mention the carjacking when he reported Kenyate missing to the police? Why was he rearranging things in the trunk?
To answer those questions, detectives haul Darren back down to the station and confront him about the surveillance footage.
Darren, you know why you're here.
We saw all the surveillance at the gas station.
He basically, at that point, identifies his brother, Dewan Poe, as, in fact, the person that carjacked him.
What happened next?
He left for Kenyate. I didn't know he was going to do anything like this.
Why didn't you tell us this before?
I didn't want my brother to go to prison.
Darren says that he didn't mention the carjacking initially because he was trying to protect his brother.
To detectives, Darren's news story doesn't ring entirely true.
Darren's claim that he kept the carjacking from the police to protect his brother just doesn't add up. Because again, why is he moving stuff around in the trunk?
Why he would let this happen, just get out of the car and let Dewan go off without calling anybody. It just didn't seem to make any sense.
I'm not buying it. Stand up.
Convinced that he and brother Dewan conspired to murder Kenyate, detectives placed Darren under arrest. Shortly after that, Dewan gets wind of his brother's arrest and turns himself in.
He knew they were coming for him.
Darren and Dewan are charged with first-degree murder. Kenyate's family is stunned. They can't believe Darren was involved.
Darren was pretending to be such a wonderful husband, but it was just all fake. It was fake, it was phony, it was staged.
But what exactly was Darren's motive for murdering Kenyate? Protecting his brother? Keeping his homosexual affair under wraps? Or something else? As Darren and Dewan's trial plays out, it becomes evident that the motive in this case was even more heinous than anyone ever imagined.
It could have been a film. It could have been either a B movie or it could have been an Oscar award-winning film. The details were just so ridiculous.
In June 2013, almost 4 years after Kenyate Collier Brewer was brutally murdered, the trial begins for her accused killers, her husband, Darren Brewer, and his brother, Dewan Poe.
We were really anticipating the trial, wanting to just get through it, get it over with, so that they can pay for what they've done.
In an unusual move, the state decides the two brothers will be tried together, though they will be represented by separate legal counsel. And when their respective attorneys deliver their opening statements, it becomes clear the brothers are willing to throw each other under the bus in order to save their own skin.
It kind of became a brother against brother situation. The defense attorneys each kind of blamed the other's client. Dewan Poe's attorney said he had nothing to do with it. It was all Darren Brewer's plan. Darren Brewer's attorney said he was in denial. He didn't know what was going to happen when Dewan and Kenyate drove away in that car.
But there's one thing Dewan and Darren's attorneys can agree on. The dueling versions of the crime indicate there's enough reasonable doubt to acquit both men on all charges.
The defense attorneys for Darren Brewer and Dewan Poe said the evidence was lacking.
Prosecutors countered that the brothers conspired to murder Kenyate and concocted the fake carjacking as a ruse to mask their involvement in the crime. Only after the surveillance video implicated both of them in the crime did the brothers turn on each other.
There seemed to be this faithfulness where Dewan would try and go do this for his brother. Then once they're in the courtroom, they're turning on each other.
As for motive, prosecutors claim Darren would go to any length, including murder, to keep his superiors at the National Guard from learning about his secret gay life.
Darren had an image to maintain, especially with the military. If they would have learned that he was gay, it may have jeopardized his career.
But prosecutors argue Darren's motive had a financial angle as well.
Apparently there was an insurance policy. It was initially $50,000 that had recently been increased.
At the time of the murder, Darren had life insurance policies on Kenyate totaling more than $150,000. Policies, prosecutors say, would be worthless in the event of a divorce.
If the marriage ended, the life insurance policies could go away.
Darren has reached a point of no return. He's maybe feeling some sense of desperation. I've got this relationship with this fellow that I want to continue. It probably had him at a point where he's like, my wife, Kenya Tay, has got to die.
So now he needs to move quickly. So Darren and his brother plotted together to kill her and that they would split this money.
There's an additional reason.
According to prosecutors, in DeJuan's case, the insurance money is only half the motive.
To prevent her from making a rape allegation against one of these defendants.
Not only do we have Darren trying to cash in on a life insurance policy, we also have the two brothers trying to silence Kenya Tay about the rape. There aren't very many cases where you have two motives.
Ladies and gentlemen, allegations and suppositions do not a case make.
Darren's defense attorney calls the state's theory preposterous and argues that brother DeJuan acted alone when he murdered Kenya Tay.
DeJuan, cold-bloodedly and with malice, took the life of Kenya Tay.
They said that it was DeJuan Poe who was the actual trigger man. He's the one who stood over Kenya Tay and fired 2 messengers of death into her head.
It's an allegation DeJuan's defense attorney has difficulty refuting, given police had recovered the murder weapon from underneath his bed. But if that was the case, why hadn't Darren tried to stop his brother from murdering Kenya Tay? Darren's defense attorney argues it's because Darren thought DeJuan was just going to scare Kenya Tay into keeping quiet about the rape allegations and had no idea his brother intended to kill her.
That night when DeJuan carjacked Darren and Kenya Tay and the kids, Darren's attorney said that he believed that they were just going to have a conversation, that DeJuan and Kenya Tay were going to sit in the car and talk and figure out how to handle what had happened between them.
But prosecutors assert Darren knew exactly what was about to transpire that evening. And to back up their assertion, they call the defendant's cousin, Taryn Webb, to the stand to testify.
Taryn, do I understand you overheard a conversation between these two brothers?
Yes, sir. Well, there was a first attempt. They wanted to go over to her house and strangle her and make it look like a robbery gone bad.
The initial plan is that DeJuan Poe is going to kill the wife and make it look like maybe an apparent robbery gone bad.
And what happened after that?
I guess he went and got sidetracked, and he didn't end up killing her. He ended up having sex with her.
When he went to do it, he saw her coming out of the bathroom and became aroused, and they had sex.
It's very striking to me that he went to the home to supposedly to strangle her, but had sex with her. There's something very twisted and psychotic about that.
Taryn says this was the alleged rape Kenya Tay told Darren about.
So now DeJuan and Darren come up with a plan that they definitely have to get rid of her. They need the life insurance money. They can't have this rape allegation out there. Darren has another lover. They must do something. They then devise a plan to do a carjacking.
Following Taryn's chilling testimony, prosecutors paint a picture of what happened next. After Kenya Tay finished work on the evening of October 25th, she picked up Darren and the kids and asked him to drive home because she was tired after her long shift.
He got off of the Dan Ryan Expressway on the south side of the city, and he didn't go to just the first gas station off the expressway. He went several blocks west, and that's where it all seemed to begin.
Hey, get in the car! Get in the driver's seat now! Get in the front seat!
With Darren and Kenya Tay's children looking on, a masked DeJuan played out the fake carjacking to an unwitting Kenya Tay. After leaving the gas station, Darren pulled into a dimly lit alley not far from their home in Logan Square.
Shut the hell up and get in the trunk.
Whatever you do not hurt me.
DeJuan orders her into the trunk.
Shut up before I kill you.
Darren ends up being dropped off with the kids, and then DeJuan drives off with her in the trunk. He doesn't go very far before the car is discovered in very close proximity to their residence up on the north side.
According to prosecutors, unaware that she knew her abductor, a frightened Kenyate begged for mercy.
No, please don't.
But DeJuan showed none.
He ends up cold-bloodedly killing her.
It's a gruesome account, but it's also complicated and could make the jury's job difficult. DeJuan pulled the trigger, but was Darren the crime's real mastermind?
I feel that Darren lured his brother in with the money. And to me, it's like this is something that he had premeditated.
And of course, in DeJuan Poe's instance, obviously he was looking to have a financial gain, and now he's secondarily motivated by the fact that there's a possibility that he's going to be arrested with her outcry of this rape that he's saying was consensual.
Between the multiple motives and conflicting accounts, it seems like the road to a guilty verdict is a bumpy one. But prosecutors still have one card left to play. And for these two alleged murderers, it will mean the difference between a life of freedom or one behind bars.
There was a good sense that the other shoe was going to drop at some point.
The trial of brothers Darren Brewer and DeJuan Poe has revealed a bizarre plot that prosecutors claim culminated with the murder of Darren's wife, Kenyate Collier Brewer.
You got this guy that's known his wife his whole life, but all along he's got this secret life that he's trying to hide from her.
The news that Darren was gay and had relationships, and the fact that the brother was supposed to have strangled his sister-in-law and then wound up having sex with her.
There were just all of these layers to this. The failed attempt to kill her the first time in the carjacking. How cold it seemed to be driving the car with your wife in the trunk and your kids right there, and then just to walk away.
But with each brother pointing the finger at the other, is it possible they both could walk?
Despite all of the loyalty that had allegedly been shown between the two brothers, the one carrying out this plan for the other, the one trying to protect the other against the rape allegation, that all ended in the courtroom.
Despite all of the back and forth, prosecutors have an ace up their sleeve, one they've been holding since the day the two brothers were arrested.
Darren confessed on videotape.
It's damning evidence. There's nothing more powerful than a confession.
Prosecutors contend Darren's confession is proof their theory about the crime is legit. And after closing arguments, the jury begins to deliberate. Kenyate's family hopes they'll deliver some measure of justice.
When someone does something like this, you want them to be punished. And that's what we wanted. We wanted them to be punished.
After several hours of deliberation, the jury announces it's reached verdicts for both Darren and DeJuan.
The verdict on both of the brothers was guilty. Darren was sentenced to 99 years in the Illinois Department of Corrections, and his brother, DeJuan, received life sentence plus 21 years.
It was a relief. They got what they deserved. You act like an animal, then you need to be treated like one.
Although Kenyate's family feels vindicated, the verdicts can't fill the void created by her death or the pain wrought by Darren and DeJuan's cold-blooded actions motivated by secrets, greed, and double lives.
It's like somebody has really ripped your heart right out of your chest. You know, no anesthesia, just in and out. Just clawed your heart out of your chest.
We're looking at two young men who clearly have some severe sociopathy within them. At best, she ran into some bad characters. At worst, she walked into a setup.
What should have been a promising future for a young soldier in the Illinois National Guard and his nurse wife and their three lovely children.
The silence of a Boston winter can be deceptive, a biting cold that muffles secrets as effectively as the heavy snow blankets the historic brick streets of Beacon Hill. For 30 years, the disappearance of Elena Moretti had been one of those secrets, a haunting question mark hanging over a city that prided itself on pedigree, prestige, and the kind of high society discretion that money can buy. It was 1995, a year of transition, but for the Moretti family, time simply stopped on a bleak November Tuesday. Elena, A vibrant gallery owner with a penchant for rare artifacts had vanished into thin air, leaving behind a half-finished cup of espresso, a locked study, and a husband, Julian, whose grief was as polished and impeccable as his bespoke suits. For 3 decades, the file sat in the basement of the Boston Police Department, a textbook cold case that had become a cautionary tale for junior detectives. Don't get obsessed with the ghosts of the past. The narrative was cemented, accepted, and undisturbed, until the champagne started flowing at a gala retirement party in the heart of the city's financial district. It was there, amidst the clinking of crystal and the hum of polite conversation, that the carefully constructed facade of a perfect marriage finally disintegrated, triggered by a face in the crowd and a piece of forensic evidence that had been hiding in plain sight for an entire generation. The scene of the disappearance back in 1995 was a masterclass in clean, calculated erasure. The Moretti residence, a sprawling Victorian brownstone, showed no signs of struggle, no forced entry, no frantic departure. Elena had been scheduled to fly to Florence for an auction, and when she didn't show, the narrative offered up by Julian was seamless. She had left early, perhaps had a change of heart, perhaps wanted a bit of solitude away from the stifling expectations of their social circle. The police search was thorough by the standards of the mid-90s, but the lack of physical evidence created a vacuum that was quickly filled by rumors. Some whispered of an affair, others of a secret life, and the cynical few wondered if she had simply had enough of the Boston elite. But the truth, as it so often does, was rooted in the mundane details that investigators had overlooked. A small, seemingly insignificant silver cufflink, found tucked deep behind a baseboard in the study during a botched renovation years later, became the single thread that, when pulled, would eventually unravel the entire tapestry of Julian Moretti's life. Julian Moretti was a man who moved through the world like a shark in shallow water, quiet, efficient, and utterly devoid of erratic behavior. As a partner in a high-end investment firm, his life was governed by spreadsheets, market trends, and a public persona that radiated stability. When the case went cold, Julian didn't falter. He mourned publicly, then retreated into a productive, if solitary, existence, eventually becoming one of the most respected figures in the city's philanthropic community. He was the man who chaired the annual Winter Ball, the man who funded the restoration of city libraries, the man who never remarried, keeping the memory of his lost wife alive in the public consciousness with just the right amount of sorrow. Yet, the shadows of the past are long, and in Boston, where old money and old grudges are the currency of the realm, it is nearly impossible to bury a secret so deep that it doesn't eventually leach into the groundwater of public life. The breakthrough, if you could call it that, came not from a sudden realization of guilt, but from the slow, relentless advance of molecular biology. Forensic science in 1995 was a blunt instrument, but by 2026, it had become a precision tool capable of reading the smallest scrap of biological history. That silver cufflink, long dismissed as a minor piece of debris from a forgotten renovation, was tested at the request of a persistent cold case task force, a group of young investigators who had no stake in the reputation of the city's elite. The DNA extracted from the internal hinge of the cufflink, a trace of dried sweat and a single microscopic flake of skin, did not match Julian Moretti, nor did it match Elena. Instead, it linked to a distant relative of a man who had vanished from the Boston docks in the winter of 1995, a low-level warehouse manager whose disappearance had been classified as an unrelated, accidental death. The dots were not just connecting, they were forming a roadmap that led directly back to the night Elena Moretti went missing. The investigation into that warehouse manager, Thomas Reed, opened up a terrifying parallel narrative. Reed had been the Moretti family's private driver and, as investigators soon discovered, a man who had been intimately involved in Julian's illicit financial dealings. The cufflink wasn't just jewelry, it was a token, a mark of status that Julian had gifted his fixer. Suddenly, the domestic tragedy of a missing wife transformed into a corporate thriller, a story of embezzlement, shadow accounts, and the desperate measures taken to keep the truth from surfacing. The detectives began to look at the Moretti residence again, this time with the help of ground-penetrating radar that didn't exist in the 90s. They scoured the property, the grounds, the nearby wharf, and even the industrial site where Reed had worked, looking for any inconsistency in the earth that had stood undisturbed for 30 years. The tension within the police department was palpable. Julian Moretti was a titan of industry, a man with friends in the mayor's office and the governor's mansion. Every step the investigators took was monitored, every lead questioned, every warrant reviewed with intense scrutiny. But the evidence was piling up, a relentless, mounting mountain of digital, financial, and physical proof that defied the power of influence. The detectives found the shadow accounts, the offshore transfers that spiked the day after Elena disappeared, and the damning, encrypted correspondence between Julian and Reed, a digital ghost of a conversation that had been buried in a long-abandoned server. It was clear that Elena Moretti hadn't just disappeared. She had been liquidated as a liability, a casualty in a war for control over an empire she had unknowingly threatened to expose. The arrest was choreographed with the clinical precision of a military operation, timed to coincide with the most public event of Julian's life, his retirement gala. It was the irony of the ages. The city's most influential philanthropist, standing under the gilded dome of the city's most prestigious hotel, surrounded by the very people who had looked up to him for decades, waiting to be honored for his lifetime of service. As the orchestra prepared to play the final chords of the night, the heavy double doors of the ballroom swung open, and the mood of the room shifted from celebratory to catatonic. There was no chaos, no dramatic chase, just the cold, inevitable arrival of justice. The detectives walked through the crowd, their faces set in hard, unyielding lines, and moved toward the stage where Julian stood with a glass of champagne in his hand, a smile frozen on his face as he realized that the past he had spent his life burying had finally clawed its way to the surface. The fallout was instantaneous, a total collapse of the Moretti name that rippled through the financial markets and the social registers of the city. The gala, meant to be a crowning achievement of a legacy, became the scene of a cultural execution. As the handcuffs clicked shut, the silence in the ballroom was absolute, a heavy, suffocating realization that the man they had toasted all night was not a hero, but a monster who had hidden in plain sight for 30 years. The headlines the next morning were brutal, the imagery of a man arrested in his tuxedo, his pristine world vanishing in the flash of news cameras. It was the ultimate cold case resolution, a public, theatrical dismantling of a life built on a foundation of deception. Within the walls of the interrogation room, the facade finally cracked. Julian, the master of control, found himself in a space where his influence meant nothing, where the only thing that mattered was the weight of the evidence on the table. He didn't confess immediately, but as the tapes were played, the records of his payments, the accounts of his associates, the undeniable proof of his coordination with Reed, the silence he had maintained for 3 decades became his own worst enemy. The story he had told himself, that he was a man who had simply done what was necessary to protect his empire, was stripped away, leaving behind the chilling reality of a man who had orchestrated the death of his own wife with the same cold indifference he used to close a business merger. The community reaction was a complex mixture of shock, betrayal, and a grim, cathartic relief. Families who had walked the streets of Beacon Hill for years, unaware of the horror that had taken place behind the brick walls of the Moretti home, now viewed their neighborhood through a lens of profound suspicion. It was a realization that evil does not always wear a mask of depravity. Sometimes it wears a tuxedo and a smile, and it drinks champagne at your parties. The case became a permanent stain on the history of the city, a lesson in the dangers of prestige and the power of secrets. The search for Elena had finally ended, not with the homecoming everyone had hoped for in 1995, but with a forensic accounting of a life brutally cut short. As the legal proceedings began, the city waited for the truth to be fully articulated in a court of law. The ghost of Elena Moretti, once a fading memory, now stood at the center of the city's consciousness. Her story, once a cautionary tale about the perils of high society, became a testament to the fact that no secret is permanent, that the truth has a gravity of its own, and that no matter how long the shadows may be, they will eventually dissipate in the light of evidence. The case was solved, But the trauma remained, a lingering, haunting reminder of the night in 1995 when the silence of the Boston winter first began to scream, and the man who had orchestrated it all finally found himself caught in the very trap he had spent a lifetime setting. The aftermath of Julian Moretti's arrest at the Gala was not merely a local sensation. It was a societal earthquake that leveled the reputation of one of Boston's most venerable dynasties in the span of an hour. The immediate public reaction was characterized by a sickening sense of vertigo, the realization that the man who had been the face of institutional stability had, for 30 years, been presiding over a reality built on a bedrock of cold-blooded homicide. Inside the Boston Police Department, the atmosphere was one of frantic, high-octane energy. The Cold Case Task Force, having operated in the shadows for months, was now the center of a national media storm. They were tasked with the gargantuan effort of turning a historic arrest into a prosecutable conviction, which meant moving from the symbolic victory of the arrest to the concrete, indisputable facts of a crime. As investigators systematically tore apart the Moretti estate, they discovered that Julian's control had been as absolute as his public persona was flawless. The brownstone on Beacon Hill, which had served as the backdrop for Elena's life and death, was revealed to be a prison of surveillance and psychological warfare. Hidden behind the elegant, antique-filled rooms were sophisticated wiretapping systems, microcameras, and sound-dampening panels that Julian had installed in the early 90s. It wasn't just a house, it was a recording device, a way for him to monitor every facet of Elena's existence, from her private phone calls to her intimate conversations with friends. The detectives were not just finding evidence. They were uncovering the blueprint of a man who believed that the only way to manage a world as complex as his was to exercise total, panoptic control over everyone in his orbit. The forensic team, working through the layers of the brownstone, began to find traces of the original crime scene that had been scrubbed clean by Julian's cleaners in 1995. Utilizing advanced chemical luminescence, which reacts to the smallest residue of hemoglobin, they traced a path of blood droplets from the master study through a hidden service staircase that led directly to the garage. The narrative they were building was becoming clear. Elena hadn't simply vanished. She had been hunted within the walls of her own home. The realization that she had been trapped, unable to escape the watchful eyes of the man who had pledged to be her protector, sent a cold shock through the investigation team. It wasn't just a crime of opportunity or greed. It was an act of sustained, premeditated terror, meticulously executed by a man who had felt perfectly comfortable in his own skin while planning the end of his wife's life. The financial records that had been recovered from the long-abandoned server were proving to be the backbone of the prosecution's case. They didn't just point to embezzlement. They painted a picture of a man who had viewed his wife as a singular, dangerous anomaly in his life. Elena, the detectives discovered, had begun to suspect the truth about the firm's shadow accounts. She had been quietly documenting the irregularities, unknowingly setting a timer on her own existence. The correspondence Julian had been so careful to hide was not just business, it was a record of his growing paranoia. In the weeks leading up to November 1995, Julian and Thomas Reed, the driver, had exchanged messages that were disguised as innocent logistics but were, in truth, the operational plans for Elena's permanent removal. The cold, corporate language they used to discuss her death, referring to it as a necessary adjustment to the asset portfolio, was perhaps the most chilling aspect of the entire investigation. As the legal proceedings moved into the pretrial phase, Julian Moretti's defense team began their attempt to insulate their client from the mounting wave of evidence. They argued that the new forensic evidence was the product of technological overreach, that the DNA testing of the decades-old cufflink was an intrusive, unconstitutional violation of privacy, and that the financial records were circumstantial, lacking the direct link required for a murder conviction. The defense's primary narrative was that Julian had been the victim of a sophisticated conspiracy, a man whose success had made him an easy target for law enforcement looking to score a high-profile win. They painted him as a tragic figure, a man whose life had been dedicated to the betterment of Boston, now being dragged through the mud by a state that was desperate to pin a 30-year-old mystery on the most convenient, high-profile individual they could find. But the public was not buying the narrative of the martyr. The sheer volume of evidence, combined with the visceral, human reality of Elena's disappearance, was creating a consensus that was impossible for the defense to ignore. The community was turning against the man who had once been the city's darling. The board of directors at the charitable foundation he had headed for 2 decades moved to strip his name from the organization, and the university that had long been a recipient of his endowments announced an internal review of all past donations. The institutional support that had shielded Julian for years was evaporating, leaving him exposed and vulnerable, for the first time in his life, to the unvarnished consequences of his actions. He was finding that in the court of public opinion, prestige was no match for the revelation of a life-ending secret. In the interrogation room, Julian remained a study in disciplined, icy detachment. He spoke little, his words carefully measured, his demeanor that of a man who was observing the proceedings rather than living them. Yet, the detectives were noticing subtle changes in his behavior. As they presented the images of the blood droplets found in the hidden staircase, or the records of the bank transfers that had paid for Thomas Reed's abrupt, suspicious relocation to South America in 1996, Julian's composure would slip. His jaw would tighten, his focus would sharpen. These were not the reactions of a man who was being falsely accused. They were the reactions of a man who was watching his entire life's work being systematically dismantled. The detectives were using his own arrogance against him, baiting him with the idea that he had been caught not by a superior force, but by the very technology he had assumed would never be able to reach into his past. The search for Thomas Reed, the missing driver, had become a massive international hunt. The investigators had tracked his trail to a remote coastal village in Brazil, where he had been living under an assumed identity for over 2 decades. The diplomatic and logistical challenge of securing his testimony was enormous, but the task force was determined. If they could bring Reed back to Boston, they would have the final piece of the puzzle, the eyewitness who had actually carried out the orders. The possibility of Reed's return was looming over Julian like a guillotine. He knew that the moment Reed stepped onto the witness stand, his defense would be annihilated. The race was on, not just in the courts, but across borders, in the shadows of an international investigation that was looking for the one man who had been the accomplice to a perfect murder. The psychological impact on Boston's elite was staggering. The Moretti case had become the city's dark, modern mirror, a way for the wealthy and powerful to see the potential for their own moral erosion. It forced a conversation about the nature of power, the necessity of accountability, and the danger of the gentleman predator, the man whose surface-level politeness hides a core of calculated, murderous intent. The arrest had become a cultural touchstone, a way for the city to redefine itself in the wake of a crime that had been hidden for too long. People were talking, questioning, and probing, demanding a higher standard for the figures they chose to elevate. The more the story unfolded, the clearer it became that the Moretti case was not just about the death of one woman. It was about the death of a certain way of doing business in Boston. As the weeks dragged on, the trial was shaping up to be the most intense, highly watched proceeding in Massachusetts history. The courtroom was a battlefield, not just of law, but of social and cultural ideals. The prosecution had assembled a case that felt like an unstoppable engine of justice, pulling in witness after witness, document after document, all leading to the singular conclusion that Julian Moretti had planned, coordinated, and overseen the liquidation of his wife to protect his financial empire. The defense, by contrast, was looking increasingly isolated, fighting a war of attrition against a reality that was becoming more solid and undeniable with every passing day. The city was braced for the trial, waiting for the final, definitive reckoning that would conclude the story that had begun on that cold, bleak November Tuesday in 1995. Behind the scenes, the investigators were finding even more layers to the Moretti deception. They had discovered that Julian had been systematically liquidating Elena's personal art collection, piece by piece, under the guise of an international auction, funneling the proceeds into his own accounts. It was a secondary crime, an act of petty, vicious greed that revealed the depth of his detachment from the woman he had lived with for years. Elena was not a partner to him. She was a set of assets, an inventory to be liquidated and repurposed. The sheer, banal cruelty of this discovery added another dimension to the case, showing the jury that Julian's motivation was not just fear of exposure, but an inherent, sociopathic drive to control and extract value from everything around him. The evidence was painting a picture of a man who had no real connection to humanity, only to the mechanics of his own existence and the preservation of his own status. The final piece of the investigation was the analysis of the house's HVAC system, which, in a bizarre and desperate twist, Julian had used to try and neutralize the blood evidence in the immediate aftermath of the crime. He had utilized an industrial-grade ozone generator, normally used for professional restoration, to break down the organic material. But the system had been too efficient for his own good. It had left a unique chemical fingerprint in the ventilation shafts, a residue that the forensics team had identified. It was the ultimate poetic irony. The same system he had used to hide his tracks had become the very evidence that connected him to the crime. Everything Julian Moretti had built, his reputation, his fortune, his carefully controlled environment, was being turned into a prosecution weapon. The investigation was not just closing a case, it was dismantling a myth, piece by piece, revealing the ugly, mechanical truth underneath the polished veneer of the man who had thought he was the master of his own fate. The trial began under a sky of relentless, iron-gray clouds, the kind that seemed to press down on the city of Boston as if to stifle the secrets attempting to rise from the pavement. Inside the courtroom, the air was thick, recirculated, and charged with the static of 3 decades of suppressed truth. Julian Moretti entered the proceedings each morning with the same unyielding composure he had carried throughout his life, his suit impeccably pressed, his hair perfectly silver, the picture of a man who had not yet accepted that his reality had been fundamentally rewritten. But as the prosecution opened their case in chief, the gallery, a mix of jaded journalists, distant relatives of Elena, and the curious public, could sense that the foundation was already beginning to erode. The prosecution team, led by a prosecutor who had cut her teeth on long-forgotten cold cases, did not lead with emotion. They led with the mathematical, physical reality of the evidence, treating the jury as a jury of investigators rather than a jury of peers. The presentation of the shadow records, the digital footprints of the secret offshore accounts, turned the courtroom into a landscape of cold, clinical greed. The prosecution displayed, in painstaking detail, how Moretti had siphoned assets from the very firm he touted as a pillar of Boston's financial health. It wasn't just embezzlement. It was a systematic project to isolate Elena financially and socially, stripping her of the resources she would have needed to build a life independent of his influence. The lead accountant for the state walked the jury through the complex transfers that occurred in the 48 hours after Elena's disappearance. It was a sequence of events so precise, so calculated, that it shattered any lingering belief in Julian's narrative of a sudden departure. The money didn't lie. It pointed a steady, unwavering finger at the man who had been the primary beneficiary of the silence. The atmosphere shifted from the financial to the visceral when the prosecution called the forensic specialist who had re-examined the Moretti brownstone. On the giant screen, the jury was shown the reconstructed path of the blood splatter, mapped in 3D, showing the final, frantic struggle that had taken place on the hidden service staircase. The visual was not an animation. It was a reconstruction based on the chemical residues that the ozone generator had failed to reach, the deep, microscopic iron signatures that remained embedded in the wooden stairs. The silence in the room was absolute as the forensic specialist explained how the struggle had been confined, controlled, and ultimately silenced. The jury stared at the screen, and then at Julian, who remained staring straight ahead, his features tight and pale. For the first time, the man in the suit felt like a ghost, a presence that was physically there but ethically disconnected from the horror that had occurred in his own home. The defense, meanwhile, was fighting a desperate rearguard action. Their lead attorney, a man famous for his ability to sow doubt into even the most airtight cases, focused on the age of the evidence. He spent hours questioning the reliability of the forensic light sources, suggesting that the blood signatures could be the result of a botched renovation, a kitchen accident, or even the remnants of cleaning agents from the 90s. He hammered the idea that after 30 years, The distinction between a crime scene and a lived-in home was a blurry, unreliable, and ultimately subjective one. He positioned Julian as a man who had lived in a house for 3 decades, a man who had moved, changed, and renovated, and he insisted that the state was projecting a fantasy onto the mundane detritus of a long-ago life. It was a plausible argument, intellectually appealing in its complexity, yet it was struggling to gain traction against the sheer weight of the corroborating financial records. The most jarring moment of the trial arrived with the arrival of a surprise witness, an elderly former neighbor who had lived in the brownstone adjacent to the Morettis in 1995. She had been reluctant to step forward, terrified by the weight of Julian's status, but the sight of his arrest had cracked the armor of her silence. She took the stand with a trembling voice, recounting how, on that November night, she had heard a sound that had stayed with her for 30 years, a muffled, rhythmic thudding against the shared wall, followed by the sound of a heavy garage door closing, not once, but twice. She hadn't seen anything, and she had never told a soul, believing that a man like Moretti would simply make her disappear, just as he had made Elena disappear. When she pointed to Julian in the courtroom, identifying him as the man she had seen walking out of his garage shortly after that sound, the atmosphere in the room shifted. It was no longer a case about digital records and chemical residue. It was a case about the human cost of a crime that had been witnessed, but kept in the shadows. The cross-examination of the neighbor was a brutal display of defensive lawyering, as they attempted to tear her memory apart, asking if she had been wearing her glasses, if the streetlights had been working, if she had been drinking wine that night, if the acoustics of the old brownstones could have played tricks on her senses. They treated her not as a person who had carried a burden for 30 years, but as a faulty instrument to be discarded. But the jury watched, and for the first time, their expressions showed a collective, simmering resentment toward the defense. The lawyers' tactics were effective in a legal sense, but they were a disaster in a human sense. They were making the jury feel as though they were being asked to disregard the very human, visceral truth of what had happened, in favor of a technicality of acoustic physics. The defense was winning the argument, but losing the jury. As the week drew to a close, the prosecution made their final move before the weekend recess. They entered into evidence the transcripts of the encrypted correspondence between Moretti and Thomas Reed. The judge allowed the transcripts to be read into the record, and the jury listened to the dry, cold, corporate speak that had been the soundtrack to the murder of Elena Moretti. The words were damning, not for their violence, but for their complete lack of it. The way they treated a human life as an inventory issue to be resolved with maximum efficiency and minimum disruption. It was the ultimate, final exposure of Julian Moretti's world. The jurors looked at the transcripts, then back at Julian, who remained a statue, and the contrast between the man and the documentation of his inner life was total. He was no longer a person to them. He was a machine, a calculating, relentless instrument of his own ambition. Over the weekend, the city of Boston was a pressure cooker. The newspapers, the talk radio programs, the digital feeds, everything was consumed by the revelations of the week. The cold case was no longer a mystery to be pondered. It was a reality to be faced. The trial had forced the city to acknowledge the depth of the deception, the ease with which a monster could move through the halls of power, and the terrifying realization that the systems designed to protect the public had been so easily manipulated. The trial was not just about Julian Moretti. It was about the integrity of the structures that had enabled him. It was a moment of profound civic soul-searching as the public began to question how many other secrets were currently hiding behind the brick walls of Beacon Hill, waiting for a piece of forensic light to expose them. When the court reconvened on Monday, the prosecution called their final witness, a lead investigator from the Cold Case Task Force who had been involved in the initial search of the Moretti brownstone back in 1995. He was asked to read his original report, a document that was a testament to the limitations of the era. He read the lines describing how they had found no sign of struggle, how they had cleared the house, and how they had found no reason to suspect foul play. He read the lines with a growing, palpable shame, his voice cracking as he looked at the jury. He was not just testifying for the state. He was testifying as a victim of the same system that Julian had manipulated, a man who had been lied to and used as a tool to solidify a perfect murder. It was a raw, devastating moment of self-reflection that underscored the entire purpose of the trial, not just to punish the guilty, but to reveal the systemic failures that had allowed the guilty to remain untouchable for so long. Julian Moretti finally broke his silence during the prosecution's closing of their case, or rather, his defense team broke it for him. They announced that they would not be calling any more witnesses. The decision was sudden, unexpected, and seemed to catch the entire courtroom off guard. The prosecution had been prepared for a week of further rebuttal, for a defense that would try to present Moretti as a pillar of the community who had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time. By closing their case, the defense was conceding the battlefield. They were attempting to limit the damage, to prevent the prosecution from presenting further, potentially even more damning evidence. It was an admission of defeat, a realization that the narrative they had built had been utterly incinerated. The judge ordered a brief recess before the closing arguments, and the courtroom felt as though it were vibrating. Moretti stood, for the first time in weeks, looking not at the jury, but out the window toward the city's skyline he had helped shape. He was a man who had finally realized that his world was shrinking, that the walls he had built were no longer a protection, but a cage. The jury left the room, their faces unreadable, their expressions masks of duty, but the feeling in the room was that the verdict had already been written in the air. The trial had been a long, agonizing excavation of a city's darkest secret, and the time for burying it was over. The truth was not just standing in the room, it was the only thing left in it. The final, definitive chapter of the Boston 1995 cold case was about to be written, and for the first time in 30 years, the city of Boston was ready to read it. The closing arguments of the trial felt less like a summation of facts and more like the final, solemn reading of a historical record that had been corrected after 3 decades of error. The courtroom was packed so tightly that the air seemed thin, filled with the collective breath of a city waiting for a conclusion that would fundamentally reshape its understanding of justice. The prosecutor, walking to the podium with a calm, measured pace, did not need to shout. She had spent the last several weeks building a structure of evidence that was, by now, essentially unassailable. She began by recounting the last day of Elena Moretti's life, not as a speculative narrative, but as a sequence of events woven together from bank records, acoustic testimony, and the cold, unyielding science of the hidden stairs. A man like Julian Moretti, she began, her voice echoing in the absolute silence, does not succeed by leaving loose ends. He succeeds by meticulously anticipating them. He planned for the police, he planned for the neighbors, and he planned for the passage of time. He gambled on the idea that in 30 years, the technology of the truth would be no better than the technology of his own deception. He lost that gamble because he underestimated the one thing he never controlled, the persistence of the truth. She turned to the jury, her gaze sweeping across them. He didn't just kill a woman. He killed a life, a history, and he did it with the cold, corporate precision of a man who viewed his wife as a depreciating asset. He didn't hide his crime. He integrated it into the structure of his entire life, burying it beneath the weight of his philanthropy and his influence. But today, the weight of his own actions is finally too heavy to bear. The defense, for their closing statement, was a shadow of the polished, aggressive entity that had begun the trial. Their lead counsel, looking visibly weary, attempted a final, desperate appeal to the jury's sense of doubt. He urged them to look beyond the narrative of the monster and focus on the absence of a body. "Where is the victim?" he asked, his voice lacking its former theatrical punch. "Where is the definitive, incontrovertible proof that Elena Moretti did not simply walk away from a life she no longer wanted? You are being asked to build a conviction on blood signatures and financial patterns, not on the physical reality of a life taken. To convict a man on the shadows of the past is not justice. It is a surrender to the temptation of closure at any cost." It was a plea that rang hollow in the room. The jury had seen the transcripts, they had seen the 3D reconstructions, and they had seen the man sitting at the defense table. The defense was not arguing against the evidence. They were arguing against the reality that the jury had already accepted. The judge's instructions to the jury were a lengthy, complex read-through of the legal standard for a conviction of capital murder. As the foreman of the jury took the thick stack of documents, the room felt as though it were being pulled into a vacuum. The jury retreated to their deliberations, and the courtroom and the city outside entered a state of suspended animation. The courthouse corridors, once filled with the frantic energy of the media, fell into a heavy, expectant silence. In the holding cell, Julian Moretti remained in his customary state of composed indifference, but the sharp-eyed bailiffs noted the subtle, telltale signs of his strain. The way he stared at his own hands, the way he constantly shifted his weight, the way he seemed to be listening to the silence of the building as if it were a verdict already in progress. Deliberations lasted for 2 days, a period that felt like 2 decades for the families and the investigators who had staked their lives and careers on this outcome. The city of Boston held its breath, the news cycles playing the same snippets of testimony, the same interviews with legal experts, and the same somber shots of the brownstone on Beacon Hill. The trial had become more than a criminal proceeding. It was a cultural event, a way for the city to engage with the uncomfortable history of its own elite, and the jury knew that their decision would be the final word on an era of history that had been defined by a murder that everyone knew about but no one dared to speak. When the buzzer finally sounded on the afternoon of the second day, the signal traveled through the courthouse like an electric current. As the jury filed back into the room, the tension was visceral. The foreman, a man who had spent the last 3 decades of his life working in the quiet, precise world of high-end manufacturing, held the verdict form with a steady, clinical grip. The judge took a seat, the clerk called the court to order, and the defendant was brought to the stand. Julian Moretti stood, his suit now slightly rumpled, his eyes fixed on the judge, his posture still maintaining that facade of aristocratic detachment. The clerk took the form, read the contents, and then, in a voice that seemed to vibrate against the silence, delivered the verdict. We, the jury, find the defendant, Julian Moretti, guilty of the charge of murder in the first degree. The sound that followed was not a gasp, but a sudden, rushing exhale that swept through the gallery. For a second, time seemed to freeze. Julian Moretti didn't move. He didn't react. He simply stood there, a man whose reality had just been dismantled. Then, he looked up, not at the judge, not at the jury, but toward the back of the courtroom, where a distant relative of Elena was sitting, his face twisted in a mixture of raw pain and long-awaited relief. The look that Julian gave him was not one of defiance or hatred. It was one of utter, empty exhaustion. The monster had been unmasked, the narrative had been corrected, and the secret had finally been brought into the light. The sentencing phase began immediately, a grim procedural necessity that served to underscore the finality of the verdict. The prosecution, in a closing statement that will be studied in legal schools for years to come, focused on the need for a sentence that reflected not just the act of the murder, but the 30 years of systemic corruption and psychological terror that Julian had visited upon the community and the memory of Elena. Justice in this case is not just about the loss of a life, the prosecutor declared. It is about the reclamation of the truth from a man who thought he could own it. We are not sentencing a man for what he did on a single night in 1995. We are sentencing a man for the theft of 30 years of potential, 30 years of truth, and 30 years of peace. The judge, a man who had presided over the regional circuit for 2 decades, delivered the sentence with a final, unyielding gravity. Julian Moretti, he began, looking down from his bench, you have spent your life building an empire on the foundation of a crime you thought you had perfected. You believed that you were an exception to the natural laws of consequence, and that your status granted you an immunity that the rest of humanity could only dream of. You have been proven wrong. The truth you tried to bury has finally risen to meet you. The sentence was life, without the possibility of parole, a verdict that was received in the courtroom with a silence, so profound it felt as though the very building were listening. As Julian Moretti was led away in handcuffs, the news of the verdict broke across the world with the force of an explosion. In Boston, the reaction was not one of celebration, but of a grim, quiet satisfaction. The city had finally faced its own reflection, and the image that stared back was one that it had needed to see for 30 years. The case of Elena Moretti was closed, but the story of what it meant for Boston was only just beginning. The brownstone on Beacon Hill, once a monument to a perfect marriage, was now a hollow, silent shell, a historical site of a tragedy that had finally found its voice. The trial had been the final, necessary act of a long, dark play, and as the lights in the courtroom dimmed, the city felt a collective sense of release. The cold, bleak winter of 1995 had finally come to an end, and for the first time in 30 years, the city could finally look toward the coming spring. In the days after the verdict, the public began to peel away the layers of the Moretti myth, discovering the depth of his reach. They found that he had systematically infiltrated city committees, bought the loyalty of police officials, and created a network of influence that had effectively paralyzed the investigation in its infancy. It was a revelation that turned the Moretti trial into a catalyst for a sweeping, statewide investigation into the intersections of wealth, politics, and the administration of justice. The trial had exposed the fault lines of the city, and the aftermath would be years of reform, oversight, and a fundamental shift in the way that Boston engaged with its own power structures. The cold case had not just been solved, it had acted as a wrecking ball for an entire culture of impunity. The final image that remained in the minds of the people who had watched the trial was not of Julian Moretti in his prime, or of the man who had been arrested at his gala. It was the image of the man in the holding cell, sitting on the cold, concrete floor, the weight of his own history finally becoming the gravity he could no longer escape. The man who had been the architect of his own perfect, hidden life had finally become the prisoner of the only thing he could not control, the reality of his own actions. The trial had concluded, the verdict had been rendered, and the city was left to pick up the pieces, to grapple with the truth, and to acknowledge that in the final calculation, no amount of money, no amount of influence, and no amount of time can ever truly bury the truth of a human life lost to the cold, calculating greed of another. Elena Moretti was finally at peace, and for the first time in 30 years, the city of Boston could finally, truly, let her rest. The sentencing of Julian Moretti was not merely a judicial conclusion, it was the final, formal exorcism of an era. As the judge's gavel struck the wood, signaling a life sentence without the possibility of parole, the sound seemed to resonate far beyond the confines of the courtroom, echoing through the halls of every financial institution, every charitable board, and every high society parlor in Boston. The man who had once been the city's golden boy, the architect of skylines and the benefactor of libraries, had been reduced to a serial number within the state's correctional system. Yet, for those who had lived through the decades of his shadow, the sentencing was only the beginning of a much larger, more grueling process, the collective reclamation of the city's moral narrative. The news of his incarceration hit the streets of Beacon Hill like a tidal wave, washing away the carefully cultivated aura of perfection that had been maintained for 3 decades, leaving behind a neighborhood that suddenly felt raw, exposed, and profoundly honest. In the weeks that followed, the brownstone on Beacon Hill became the center of a different kind of public attention. It was no longer a home. It was a site of historical inquiry. The state, having secured a conviction, moved to seize the property as part of the asset forfeiture linked to Moretti's decades of financial fraud. Crowds gathered along the sidewalk, staring at the elegant, red brick facade, trying to reconcile the beauty of the architecture with the horror that had been hidden within its walls. The city, in a move that was as symbolic as it was practical, announced that the brownstone would be sold at public auction, with the proceeds dedicated to a memorial fund for victims of domestic violence. It was a final, devastating rebuke to Moretti's legacy. The very house he had used as a fortress of control would now serve to support the very cause he had tried to silence through his actions against Elena. The investigation into Moretti's wider network continued, even after the verdict. Detectives were now untangling a web of corruption that stretched into the highest echelons of the city's political apparatus. They were finding that his influence had not been accidental, it had been institutional. Through the use of shadow lobbying firms and untraceable campaign contributions, he had effectively bought the silence of a generation of regulators and law enforcement officials. The deeper the investigators dug, the more they realized that the cold case status of Elena Moretti's disappearance was not a result of police incompetence alone, but a calculated, deliberate policy of institutional neglect bought and paid for by Julian Moretti himself. This revelation turned the trial from a single criminal prosecution into a massive, citywide probe into the nature of power, influence, and the fragility of the justice system itself. The public's appetite for this new reality was insatiable. Every newspaper in New England launched investigative series on the Moretti era, digging through old records, interviewing retired officials, and bringing to light the countless small, quiet instances where the system had failed to hold him accountable. The city was undergoing a period of radical, uncomfortable transparency. For the first time in 30 years, the ordinary citizens of Boston were seeing the inner workings of the power structures that had always governed them from a distance. The realization that they had been living in a city that was, in many ways, an extension of Moretti's own ego was a bitter pill to swallow, but it was one that led to a massive, grassroots push for reform, ethics legislation, and a complete overhaul of the way municipal power was managed and monitored. Within the prison system, Moretti was living a life that was the exact inverse of his previous existence. The billionaire who had once traveled by private jet, dined at the finest restaurants, and commanded the attention of the city's most powerful people now existed in a world defined by the absolute austerity of a cell. His world had shrunk to a few concrete walls, a steel door, and the unending, repetitive noise of a high-security facility. There were no more boardrooms, no more leverage, and most importantly, no more ability to manipulate his environment. He was forced to interact with a society that was not interested in his status, his wealth, or his reputation. It was a form of total social erasure that had been the ultimate fear of his life, and now it was his permanent reality. The psychological toll on his former associates was just as severe. Those who had benefited from his patronage, who had turned a blind eye to his behavior, and who had profited from the silence he enforced were now faced with their own potential for prosecution or, at the very least, total professional ruin. The trial had created a toxic atmosphere for anyone who had been part of his network. Many of his former business partners left the city, trying to distance themselves from the radioactive aura of his name. The firm he had once built, now under new, transparent management, was fighting to survive as lawsuits and investigations continued to pile up, its reputation shattered by the revelations of his internal, sociopathic operations. It was a complete, systemic collapse of everything he had spent 40 years building, a collapse that occurred almost immediately after his facade was cracked. The role of the Forensic Task Force had shifted, too. No longer just a group of investigators, they had become the guardians of the city's historical truth. They spent their days fielding tips, reviewing older files, and helping families across Massachusetts look at their own long-ignored cold cases with new, hopeful eyes. The technology that had brought down Moretti was becoming the standard for the entire state. The forensic lab was being upgraded, staffed by a new generation of scientists who were trained in the techniques of genealogical research and chemical iron signature detection. The Boston of 2026 was a city that had effectively declared war on the concept of the unsolved crime, a city that was determined to never again let a secret fester in the dark for 3 decades. The memorial fund established by the sale of the Moretti brownstone became a thriving, vital force in the city's social services. The resources it provided for survivors of domestic violence allowed for the creation of new shelters, legal aid offices, and educational programs that were directly changing lives across the Commonwealth. It was a poetic, definitive reversal of the dynamic Julian Moretti had created. The home where he had attempted to exert absolute control over Elena's life was now the source of liberation for thousands of other women. The cycle of power he had tried to weaponize had been broken, repurposed, and directed toward the very thing he had tried to destroy, the autonomy and the safety of the vulnerable. As the months turned into a year, the trial of Julian Moretti faded from the front pages, but its legacy was deeply embedded in the cultural fabric of Boston. It was no longer a news story. It was a part of the city's identity. The way people spoke about power, the way they questioned their leaders, and the way they viewed the history of their own neighborhoods had all been transformed by the long, agonizing, and ultimately triumphant journey toward justice for Elena Moretti. The city had regained its voice, and it had learned, in the hardest way possible, that the only thing more dangerous than a man who thinks he can own the truth is a society that lets him believe it. Looking back, the entire Moretti saga was a testament to the idea that justice is not just a destination. It is a labor, a continuous, exhausting, and often dangerous struggle. The investigators, the prosecutors, the witnesses, and the jurors who had participated in the trial had all given a piece of themselves to the cause. They had faced the weight of a powerful, entrenched, and deceptive reality and had refused to be broken by it. They had looked at the cold, clinical, and often grim reality of a 30-year-old crime and had decided that the truth was worth the cost of the pursuit. In doing so, they had not just solved a cold case, they had restored the moral compass of an entire community. As the sun set over the city skyline, the new Boston looked toward a future that was, for the first time, truly its own. The skyline, once dominated by the influence of Julian Moretti, now seemed to belong to the people who walked the streets below. The secrets of the past had been brought to light, and the city was ready to write its next chapter. Not as a place of shadows and secrets, but as a place that was grounded in the honesty of its own reality. Elena Moretti, though she had been lost to the darkness for 30 years, had become the catalyst for the most profound and necessary renewal in the history of the Commonwealth. Her story was the beginning, not the end, and as the city continued to move forward, it did so with a sense of clarity, resolve, and a profound, unshakable commitment to the idea that no truth, no matter how deep it is buried, will ever truly remain in the dark. The aftermath of Julian Moretti's imprisonment was not just a period of adjustment for the city of Boston. It was an era of profound institutional mourning and reconstruction. The physical erasure of his influence continued, but the psychological landscape of the city was where the most significant changes were taking place. For the inhabitants of Beacon Hill, the brownstone, now sold and undergoing a slow, respectful renovation, stood as a testament to the fact that the past is a tangible, physical entity that can be managed, understood, and eventually transformed. The new owners, aware of the house's history, had chosen to preserve its architectural dignity while symbolically removing the remnants of the surveillance systems that Julian had installed, turning a monument to control into a residence of light and privacy. It was a subtle but powerful act of reclamation, signifying that the space had finally been released from the grip of the predator who had once turned it into a prison. Beyond the walls of the brownstone, the investigative task force had not disbanded. It had evolved. Having demonstrated that the application of modern genetic genealogy to historical evidence could bridge a 3-decade gap, the team became the model for a nationwide network of cold case units. They were now the custodians of the Moretti Protocol, a rigorous set of standards that dictated how historical crime scenes were to be re-examined in the age of molecular intelligence. Every evidence locker in the Commonwealth, once the graveyard of forgotten ambitions, was being audited, cataloged, and digitized. The team had realized that the Moretti case was not an anomaly, but the first indicator of a systemic capacity to solve the unsolvable. They were the architects of a new kind of justice, one that operated on the belief that human identity is an indelible, permanent archive that the passage of time can never fully erase. Within the social registers of the elite, the fallout was still being calculated. The trial had forced a radical reevaluation of how wealth and status were viewed in Boston. The era of the unquestionable benefactor was dead. In its place, a culture of rigorous, uncomfortable skepticism had emerged. Institutions that had once been the beneficiaries of Moretti's shadow-funded charity were now subject to quarterly public ethics audits. Donors, large and small, were no longer granted the benefit of the doubt, and the city's philanthropic sector was undergoing a transformation that favored transparency over prestige. It was a cultural shift that was deeply uncomfortable for the established families of the city, but it was an essential adjustment for the survival of the city's civic integrity. The Moretti Rule, the informal name for the city's new demand for radical transparency, had become the primary mechanism of governance for the city's private and public sectors alike. The lives of those who had brought Julian to justice were, in their own ways, forever marked by the case. The lead investigator, now a veteran of the National Cold Case Circuit, had become the primary spokesperson for the necessity of forensic investment. He traveled from state to state, speaking at conferences and law schools, emphasizing that the barrier to solving cold cases was not the nature of the crime, but the lack of commitment from the institutions charged with the responsibility of remembrance. His testimony had become a rallying cry for the next generation of detectives, a generation that was entering the workforce with the tools of 2026 and the conviction that no secret is too buried to be found. He had become the mentor for a new, emboldened police force, a group of professionals who understood that their primary allegiance was not to the powerful, but to the truth of the evidence. The family of Elena Moretti, having found their resolution, were now participating in a quiet, private process of restoration. The emotional landscape they had inhabited for 30 years, a landscape characterized by the sharp, stinging absence of their loved one, was being replaced by the steady, enduring comfort of memory. The memorial fund that had been established in Elena's name had grown into a vital foundation, providing resources for thousands of women to escape their own domestic prisons. This was perhaps the most poignant aspect of their restorative journey, the transformation of a tragedy into a life-saving enterprise. Every life that was helped by the foundation felt, to them, like a small victory, a ripple effect that had been initiated by their own relentless pursuit of the truth. They were living proof that justice, in its most powerful form, is not just the punishment of the perpetrator, it is the empowerment of the victim's surviving community. The institutional memory of the Boston Police Department had also undergone a transformation. The shame of the 1995 failure, the initial decision to overlook the signs of struggle and to accept the narrative of a sudden departure, was now treated as a required case study for every recruit. The department had internalized the lesson that an investigation is only as honest as the investigator's willingness to challenge their own assumptions, especially when those assumptions involve the elite. The culture of the BPD had pivoted from a top-down, status-conscious hierarchy to a forensic-led, evidence-driven organization. The officers on the beat were no longer just observers of their own city. They were the guardians of its history, aware that the slightest oversight could have consequences that would stretch into the next generation. As the months stretched into years, the city's relationship with the Moretti case evolved from a news story into a cultural myth. It became a story told to remind people that the things you see are not always the things that are happening, and that the silence in a neighborhood can be a shroud rather than a peace. The city had learned to read its own history with a more critical, discerning eye. The architecture, the parks, the institutional names, the physical environment was no longer taken for granted as a collection of fixed facts, but was instead viewed as a layered, complex narrative that required constant, careful interrogation. The Moretti effect had given the city a new kind of awareness, a civic consciousness that was less susceptible to the allure of wealth and more attuned to the quiet, sometimes inconvenient requirements of justice. Even the international dimensions of the case, the hunt for Thomas Reed, the driver, continued to reverberate. Reed's eventual return to Boston to testify, and his own lengthy, quiet process of reckoning within the prison system, added a layer of complexity to the city's understanding of the crime. He was not a monster in the same sense as Moretti. He was a tool, a man who had been consumed and then discarded by the man he served. The stories of their shared past, extracted through hours of depositions, painted a picture of a relationship that was built on the foundation of shared crime and, eventually, mutual destruction. It reinforced the idea that those who live in the shadows of the powerful do not escape the consequences of the darkness, even if they occupy a different level of the power structure. The city's art scene, where Elena had once been a prominent figure, also experienced a kind of revival. The galleries that she had once championed, which had struggled in the wake of her disappearance and the scandal of her husband's life, had begun to regain their purpose. They held exhibitions dedicated to the work she had loved, effectively reinserting her voice into the artistic conversation of the city. It was a beautiful, defiant reclamation of her intellectual life, a way of ensuring that she was remembered not just as the victim of a murder, but as a person with a passion, an eye for beauty, and a significant, positive influence on the cultural life of Boston. The galleries became a space where her presence was felt, not as a haunting, but as an inspiration, reminding the current generation of artists that their work is an act of creation that persists even when the world around them is clouded by greed and violence. As the 10th anniversary of the verdict approached, the city did not mark it with public speeches or grand displays of triumph. Instead, the occasion was marked with a quiet, private reflection. The city had moved on, but it had not forgotten. The lesson of the Moretti case was not meant to be celebrated. It was meant to be carried. It was a weight, a heavy, necessary weight that ensured the city would remain grounded, honest, and forever committed to the pursuit of the truth. The ghost of 1995 was finally, officially silent, and in that silence, Boston found the peace it had been seeking for 3 decades. The case was closed, the story was complete, and the city, having walked through the long, dark tunnel of its own history, was finally and fully prepared to live in the light. The final, lasting impact of the Pendleton and Moretti era was the fundamental shift in the definition of a cold case. The word had lost its power as a shorthand for unsolved. It had become a synonym for ongoing. The investigators, the family, and the society at large had reached a new understanding of their responsibility to the past, that an unsolved crime is a continuous, active obligation, a debt that the current generation owes to the future. The trial was the conclusion of a singular investigation, but the resolution of the case was the beginning of an era of forensic accountability that would define the rest of the century. The city had triumphed not by defeating a man, but by defeating the atmosphere of impunity that had allowed him to thrive, proving that when the light of justice is applied with enough persistence, even the darkest of secrets will eventually yield to the clarity of the truth. The legal architecture of Boston began to shift in the wake of the Moretti verdict, a transformation driven by the realization that justice is not a static event, but an ongoing, active mandate. The state legislature, pressured by a coalition of cold case advocacy groups and the persistent vocal advocacy of the Vance and Moretti family estates, passed the Transparency and Forensic Integrity Act of 2026. This landmark legislation, colloquially known as the Moretti Law, fundamentally altered the protocol for handling long-term unsolved crimes. It mandated the systematic reevaluation of every homicide case older than 20 years, providing dedicated state funding for the application of advanced genetic genealogy and state-of-the-art chemical residue analysis. The law was a direct, systemic response to the failures exposed during the Moretti trial, a refusal to let the lethargy of bureaucracy or the influence of the elite ever again create a sanctuary for the guilty. For the Boston Police Department, the implementation of the Moretti Law required a complete restructuring of the cold case unit. No longer a repository for dusty files and discouraged detectives, the unit became the most technically sophisticated department in the Commonwealth. The new training curriculum for detectives emphasized the archaeological method, the ability to treat a 30-year-old crime scene not as a static, decayed past, but as a living record that could be unlocked through a combination of digital reconstruction and molecular science. The department began recruiting candidates with backgrounds in data science, bioinformatics, and forensic history, shifting the culture of the institution from one of traditional investigative intuition to one of data-driven, evidence-based certainty. The cultural fallout of the case continued to ripple through the city's social strata. Beacon Hill, once the impenetrable bastion of old money secrecy, became the unlikely epicenter of this new era of civic interrogation. The brownstone that had been the stage for Elena Moretti's final moments became a site of pedagogical importance. The new owners, in cooperation with the city's Historic Preservation Commission, integrated a public-facing history exhibit into the ground floor of the house. It did not focus on the grisly details of the murder. Instead, it focused on the life of Elena Moretti as a patron of the arts and a significant figure in Boston's cultural evolution. It was a reclaiming of space, turning a monument to an act of destruction into a platform for celebrating a life that had been stolen. The house now served as a reminder that the stories of the victims, not the stories of their killers, are the ones that should endure. In the legal and academic world, the Moretti trial became the standard for forensic resilience. Law schools from Cambridge to Stanford utilized the case to demonstrate that the passage of time is no longer a defense against the truth. It highlighted the terrifying ease with which the wealthy could manipulate the investigative process in the 1990s, juxtaposing that era of impunity against the current reality where every act leaves an indelible biological signature. The case was analyzed not just from a criminal law perspective, but as a sociopolitical study of how power structures, left unchecked, can compromise the foundational integrity of the justice system itself. Students were challenged to consider the role of the investigator as a custodian of history, tasked with correcting the omissions of the past while navigating the complex privacy mandates of the present. The international cooperation spurred by the hunt for Thomas Reed in Brazil created a new, robust template for cross-border criminal extradition, specifically for crimes that had long been considered stale or non-viable. The success of the Moretti-Reed pursuit set a precedent that encouraged other nations to treat these cold cases not as historical curiosities, but as live, actionable matters of international law. The collaboration between the Boston Task Force and the Brazilian authorities led to the creation of a global network of historical forensics specialists, a collective of experts who shared the methodology, the resources, and the commitment to pursuing the long-delayed reckoning of victims from the mid to late 20th century. The city's art community, deeply impacted by the revelation of how Elena's collection had been plundered, launched a massive, coordinated effort to repatriate the stolen items. The Moretti Auction Recovery Project, working with Interpol and the leading international galleries, managed to track down and return nearly 80% of the original Moretti collection. Many of these pieces were donated to the Museum of Fine Arts, with permanent plaques acknowledging Elena Moretti as the original donor. It was a profound act of restorative justice, ensuring that the legacy of her life's work was preserved in the public consciousness, untainted by the shadow of the crime that had attempted to erase it. The galleries, once silent places of mourning, became spaces of celebration, where the beauty Elena had championed was now returned to the people of Boston as her enduring gift. The personal restoration of the investigators who had broken the case was a quiet, internal process. They had seen the true depth of human cruelty and had lived within the mechanical, sociopathic logic of Julian Moretti for years of their lives. They had emerged with a new understanding of their role in society. Many moved into roles as policy advisors or educators, seeking to institutionalize the lessons learned from the trial. They carried with them the memory of the Moretti Protocol, a realization that the most dangerous assumption an investigator can make is that a case is unsolvable. They taught that the unsolved status is merely a placeholder, a waiting period for the next generation of evidence and the next generation of conviction. As the years advanced, the Moretti story transitioned from a dramatic, headline-grabbing event into a foundational narrative of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. It served as a baseline for the city's maturity. The modern Boston citizen, who walked the streets of Beacon Hill and passed the renovated brownstone, understood that the city's greatness was not in its pedigree or its institutions, but in its capacity to acknowledge its own failings. The Moretti case had forced the city to grow up, to look at the dark, uncomfortable reality of its own power structures, and to demand a better version of justice. The city had found that the only way to hold onto its heritage was to be utterly, uncompromisingly honest about the moments when it had allowed that heritage to be corrupted. The ghost of 1995 was finally and fully absorbed into the fabric of history, no longer a haunting, unresolved memory, but an integrated component of the city's evolving story. The memorial to Elena Moretti, now a permanent feature of the cultural landscape, received visitors every single day, students, tourists, and families who wanted to understand how a life could be lost and how a truth could be recovered. The park on Elm Street, combined with the educational efforts at the Brownstone and the MFA, had created a circuit of remembrance that ensured the case of the Boston cold case would not just be solved, but would be honored. It was the ultimate, necessary conclusion to the long, dark winter that had finally, mercifully, yielded to the light. The resolution of the Boston case stood as a monumental triumph of the new paradigm of justice. It was a victory for the forensic science that had pierced the veil of time, a victory for the investigators who had defied the weight of institutional discouragement, and a victory for the family who had never lost faith in the necessity of the truth. The story of Elena Moretti had become the story of the city's resilience. As we reflect on the decade that followed the verdict, we realize that the most important outcome was not the punishment of the man, but the purification of the society he had attempted to own. The ghost of 1995 was finally at peace, and the city, having walked through the long, agonizing tunnel of its own history, had finally and fully emerged into the clear, unwavering light of a future that it had earned, that it understood, and that it would never, ever take for granted again. The finality of the Pendleton and Moretti eras left behind a societal landscape that was fundamentally different from the one that had existed before the breakthroughs of 2026. As the dust settled on the legal proceedings and the structural reforms of the Commonwealth were codified, a quiet, contemplative air took hold of the city of Boston. The resolution of the 1995 cold case had become a reference point, a temporal marker by which the city measured its own moral maturation. People began to speak of the pre-verdict and post-verdict eras, acknowledging that the trial had stripped away the comfortable illusions of the 20th century, forcing a realization that the past is not a foreign country, but a continuous, living thread that shapes the present in ways we are only beginning to understand. The institutional legacy of the case, the Moretti Law, began to bear fruit in the most unexpected ways. Across the Commonwealth, the systematic re-examination of cold cases started to yield resolutions for hundreds of families who had long ago resigned themselves to the status of the forgotten. The Forensic Task Force, now an established, permanent entity within the state's justice structure, became the gold standard for high-complexity investigations. They didn't just solve murders. They performed a form of historical archaeology, bringing closure to events that had occurred in a time when the tools for justice were insufficient to the task. It was a profound realization that a crime might remain unpunished for decades, but it never ceases to exist, and the state's obligation to the truth is not diminished by the passage of time. In the social realm, the Moretti rule of radical transparency became an infectious, positive force. Business leaders, municipal heads, and community organizers began to adopt a proactive approach to transparency, realizing that the public's tolerance for institutional shadow games had vanished. The city's cultural and artistic circles, once a sphere where Moretti's influence had been most subtly felt, underwent a renaissance of authenticity. New galleries, theaters, and creative spaces emerged, built on the principles of open access and community-driven curation. It was as if the city had been holding its breath for 30 years, and with the resolution of the Moretti case, it had finally begun to exhale. The cultural climate became one of genuine, unfiltered expression, no longer mediated by the curated, deceptive polish that had defined the Moretti era. For the Vance and Moretti families, the years that followed were defined by a quiet, steady peace. The media attention had long since withered away, leaving them to define their own lives outside the context of the crimes that had once occupied every waking moment. They became quiet, influential figures in the community, not as celebrities, but as the living embodiment of the lesson that persistence is its own form of power. Their quiet advocacy for victims' rights and forensic investment continued, but it was done with a sense of calm, knowing that they had achieved what once seemed impossible. They were the architects of their own healing, proving that the true resolution of a cold case is not the day the verdict is read, but the day the victim's name is no longer associated with a tragedy, but with a life that is remembered and cherished. The forensic laboratory that had been the crucible of the investigation became a site of academic significance. Scientists from all over the world flocked to Boston to learn the techniques of genetic genealogy and the extraction of trace iron signatures from historical remains. The laboratory was no longer just a place of technical labor. It was a center of innovation, a place where the history of human failure, the crimes of the past, was being solved through the progress of human ingenuity. It was a beautiful, intellectual symmetry. The tools used to expose the secrets of a murderous tycoon were now being used to protect the future, ensuring that the dark lessons of the Moretti era would prevent similar crimes from thriving in the light of the new century. Even the international community took note of the Boston paradigm. The cooperation that had been required to bring Thomas Reed back to face justice became the template for an international global cold case coalition, a body dedicated to the sharing of forensic data and the pursuit of justice across borders. The success of the Moretti case proved that no sanctuary, no matter how distant, could hide a perpetrator forever. The investigative landscape had become truly globalized, with the understanding that the law, when fueled by modern forensic technology, is a force that is no longer limited by the artificial barriers of geography or the natural decay of evidence over time. As the years passed, the brownstone on Beacon Hill ceased to be a landmark of tragedy and became a point of civic pride. The exhibit on Elena Moretti's cultural contributions drew school groups, historians, and visitors from across the world, all eager to learn the story of the woman who had been silenced for so long and whose voice had eventually, through the persistence of her family and the power of the truth, been restored to the narrative of the city. It was the ultimate victory of the victim over the perpetrator. Julian Moretti had attempted to make her existence a footnote in his own history. Instead, he had become the footnote in hers. The house served as a reminder that the endurance of the human spirit, when supported by the integrity of the law, is the most powerful force in existence. In the final, contemplative hours of a decade, one could walk the streets of Beacon Hill and see a city that was at peace with its own history. The buildings stood as they always had. The streets retained their historic character, but the atmosphere was lighter, clearer, and more grounded in the truth. The city had learned to look at its own past without fear, to see the flaws and the failures not as secrets to be buried, but as lessons to be learned. It was a mature, honest city, a city that had weathered the storm of its own dark history and had come out the other side with a refined, clear-eyed understanding of the value of justice. The ghost of 1995 was finally and fully gone, leaving behind a silence that was no longer an omission but a presence. The story was told, the record was settled, and the city, having walked through the long, agonizing tunnel of its own history, was finally and fully prepared to exist in the brilliance of its own present. Elena Moretti was finally at peace, and for the first time in 30 years, the city of Boston was not just a historical monument, it was a vibrant, living testament to the fact that no matter how long the shadows may be, they will eventually dissipate in the face of an uncovered, undeniable reality. The cold case was closed, but the truth it revealed had become the enduring, unwavering light of a future that had finally, at long last, been earned. The final chapter of the Boston 1995 cold case did not end with a dramatic exclamation point, but rather with a series of quiet, transformative shifts in the city's civic life that suggested a permanent change in its heartbeat. As the decade post-verdict drew to a close, the investigation that had once been the ultimate symbol of institutional failure had morphed into the city's primary benchmark for institutional accountability. The courtroom where Julian Moretti had stood to hear his sentence became a symbolic site of pilgrimage for legal students, a place where the past was not merely observed, but studied as a catalyst for systemic transformation. The architecture of the Boston legal system had been rebuilt on the ruins of the Moretti trial, creating a structure that was no longer dependent on the integrity of individual actors, but on the unyielding, transparent mechanisms of the law itself. Within the social registers of the elite, the long-term impact was a radical, permanent demystification of prestige. The Moretti Rule, the civic mandate that no donation, no civic project, and no public appointment could be made without an exhaustive, public-facing ethical audit, became the bedrock of Boston's municipal governance. The city's philanthropic sector, once a murky space where influence was bartered for silence, had become a model of radical transparency. Donors and civic leaders now navigated a landscape where the privacy of their wealth was subordinate to the integrity of their public footprint. It was a cultural revolution that was as effective as it was unglamorous, turning Boston into a city that had effectively immunized itself against the return of the kind of unchecked, sociopathic power that Julian Moretti had embodied for 30 years. The forensic laboratory in the heart of the city, which had first identified the blood signatures and DNA markers that brought Moretti down, continued to be a world-class center of innovation. The laboratory had expanded its scope, establishing partnerships with international universities to develop a historical forensic database. This initiative, which aimed to preserve the genetic and chemical profiles of long unsolved cases, ensured that even as technology continued to advance, the evidentiary records of the past would remain ready for the next breakthrough. The lab was no longer a place where old cases went to fade. It was the engine of an ongoing, active mission to resolve the historical debts of the Commonwealth. It stood as a beacon of the idea that technology, when applied with a moral directive, is the most powerful weapon against the erasure of history. For the family of Elena Moretti, the passing of 10 years brought a sense of profound, settled reality. They had moved beyond the trial and the media spectacle, focusing their energy on the foundation that now bore Elena's name. The foundation had become a pillar of the city's social safety net, funding programs for women in crisis, and, perhaps more significantly, establishing a statewide scholarship for forensic science students who demonstrated a commitment to truth-based historical investigation. This, for the family, was the most meaningful victory. The creation of a legacy that ensured the next generation of justice would be even more capable, more resilient, and more incorruptible than their own. They were no longer the survivors of a cold case. They were the architects of a future where Elena's tragedy would become a tool for the protection of others. The brownstone on Beacon Hill, now a fully integrated component of the neighborhood's historic district, was more than just a residence. It was a physical lesson. The exhibit on its ground floor, chronicling Elena's cultural contributions and the history of the Moretti trial, remained one of the most frequented small-scale educational sites in the city. It served as a reminder that the spaces we inhabit are not just architectural constructs, but historical ones, that every brick and every floorboard carries the potential to store the truth, and that it is the responsibility of those who come after to listen to what the space has to say. The house had been fully reclaimed, its history acknowledged, its darkest secrets exposed, and its narrative corrected, serving as a monument to the endurance of the victim in the face of the perpetrator's attempt to erase her. In the final contemplative evenings of this era, it was common to see people walking the streets of Beacon Hill, stopping in front of the brownstone or strolling over to the park where the memorial stood. There was a sense of collective ownership over the story. It was no longer just the story of a cold case, but the story of the city itself. Boston had learned to integrate its trauma rather than bury it. It had learned that the only way to move forward was to carry the past not as a weight, but as a map that showed the dangers of apathy, the cost of status, and the absolute, non-negotiable value of the truth. The city had achieved a level of civic maturity that was rarely found in the modern world, a maturity that was born of the recognition that justice is not something you are given, but something you must actively, constantly create. As for the ghost of 1995, it was finally, truly silent. The investigation was closed, the records were settled, and the memory of the crime had been processed into a permanent, constructive component of the city's identity. The investigators, who had walked the long, dark road of the case, had eventually moved into the sunset of their careers, leaving behind a department that was better, sharper, and more honest than the one they had entered. They were the silent, steady guardians of the truth, the ones who had demonstrated that the passage of time is no shield against the reach of justice. Their work was the ultimate testament to the idea that no matter how long the shadows may be, they will eventually dissipate in the face of the truth. The final lesson of the Boston cold case was that the truth is the most powerful substance in the human experience. It is the only thing that cannot be manufactured, bought, or ultimately destroyed. Julian Moretti had spent his entire life building a reality that was a perfect, crystalline lie, only to find that even the most perfect lie has a shelf life. The truth, when it finally arrived, was not just the conclusion of a criminal investigation. It was the fundamental realignment of the reality of an entire community. The case of the 1995 cold case was solved, the archives were closed, and the story had finally, at long last, been brought into the light of a new, unwavering dawn, a dawn that would continue to define the moral character of the city for generations to come. As the sun sets over the historic skyline of Boston, the city continues its steady, forward motion, but it does so with a new kind of awareness. The streets are the same, the buildings are the same, but the spirit of the place is different. It is more honest, more vigilant, and more profoundly committed to the truth. Elena Moretti's story is no longer a footnote, but a foundation, a cornerstone of a city that finally understands that its most precious resource is not its wealth or its status, but the integrity of its own history. The cold case is solved, the tragedy is integrated, and the peace, finally earned, is absolute. The record is set straight, the debt of history is paid in full, and the story of Boston, in all its complexity, its beauty, and its terrible, hard-won honesty, continues, shining clearly in the light of the truth. The resolution of the Boston 1995 cold case had become more than just a closed file. It was a cornerstone of a new civic philosophy, a permanent alteration to the DNA of the city. As we look back from the vantage point of this new era, the case of Elena and Julian Moretti serves as a profound meditation on the nature of time itself. Time, once thought of as the ultimate ally of the perpetrator, the great eraser that would fade the blood, dampen the memory, and allow the powerful to outlive the consequences of their deeds, had instead become the greatest witness. It was the passage of time that allowed the technology to catch up, the archives to be digitized, and the systemic corruption of the 90s to be isolated and rendered obsolete. The resolution proved that for the modern investigator, time is not an enemy, but a vessel in which the truth is allowed to mature until it is ripe for revelation. The systemic reforms implemented in the wake of the trial, the Moretti Law, the forensic integrity protocols, and the radical transparency of the charitable sector had created a state that was, in many ways, the most ethically scrutinized in the nation. It was a Boston that had traded its old-world reliance on reputation for a modern reliance on data. The city had realized that prestige, when untethered from honesty, is merely a mask for decay. The new culture of the city was one where the unknown was no longer a state of being, but a temporary condition of inquiry. This shift had profound implications for the legal system, as the courts themselves became more rigorous, more demanding of evidence, and less susceptible to the performative influence of the wealthy. The courtroom was no longer a place where a legacy could be bought. It was a place where a reality was confirmed. In the quiet, daily life of the city, the legacy of the case manifested in the way history was taught in schools and discussed in public forums. The story of the brownstone, the gallery, and the hidden staircase was part of the civic education of every child in Boston. It taught them that the most dangerous secrets are the ones kept in the name of the greater good, and that the most critical duty of a citizen is to remain skeptical of the narratives provided by the powerful. It was a hardening of the public spirit, a resilience born of the painful knowledge that their institutions had once failed them, and a subsequent determination to ensure that such a failure would never, ever be repeated. The Boston of 2026 was a city that looked at its own history with a level of uncompromising clarity that would have been unthinkable in the atmosphere of 1995. For the investigative team, the men and women who had spent the better part of a decade turning a 30-year-old cold case into a historical reckoning, the resolution brought a sense of professional completion that was rare in the world of law enforcement. They had operated under the assumption that they were fighting against an impossible weight, and they had won. Their victory changed the professional trajectory of thousands, as they became the models for the next generation of justice seekers. They had proven that the investigative spirit, when fueled by the technological advancements of the new century, was capable of piercing the thickest veils of time. They left behind a department that was no longer reliant on individual brilliance, but on an infrastructure of integrity, a forensic framework that would ensure that even after they retired, the work of the truth would continue unabated. The family of Elena Moretti had found a quiet sanctuary in the work of the Foundation. They had transformed the grief of her loss into the fuel for a vibrant, essential institution. Their influence on domestic violence policy, on the protection of women in high-stakes environments, and on the forensic training of law enforcement was immense. They had turned the story of Elena from a tragedy of victimhood into a story of systemic protection. Their lives were the living proof that the most profound response to violence is the creation of a world where such violence is less likely to occur. They had reclaimed her name, restored her reputation, and ensured that her memory was protected by the very systems that had once failed her so catastrophically. The brownstone on Beacon Hill, now a fully integrated and respected part of the historic district, stood as a quiet, stoic sentinel. The exhibit on the ground floor continued to attract a steady stream of visitors, each one adding their own reflection to the ongoing conversation about what the house meant and what the city had learned from the tragedy it contained. The brownstone had become a living museum of the city's conscience, a space where the past was not forgotten, but actively, carefully integrated into the present. It was a triumph of adaptive reuse, not just of a building, but of a narrative. The house was no longer a secret keeper, it was a truth teller, its architecture now serving as the frame for a story of resilience and hard-won justice. As for the ghost of 1995, it was finally at peace, not because the crime had been forgotten, but because the crime had been fully accounted for. The resolution of the Boston cold case was a victory for the concept of objective reality. In an age where narratives are often contested and the truth is frequently obscured by the interests of the powerful, the Boston case stood as a singular, crystalline example of what happens when the evidence is given the space to speak for itself. It was a triumph of the tangible over the speculative, of the forensic over the emotional, and of the enduring weight of the truth over the ephemeral nature of a lie. The trial was the final act in a long, dark drama, but the legacy of that drama was the construction of a city that was finally, truly, its own. In the final, reflective light of this era, the story of the Boston cold case stands as a beacon. It is a reminder that the institutions we rely on are only as strong as the truth we demand from them, and that the history we inhabit is not just a collection of facts, but a continuous obligation. We are the stewards of the record. We are the ones who must decide whether we will be the passive recipients of the narratives provided by the powerful or the active, investigative guardians of the reality that lies beneath. The Boston case taught us that the truth is the most radical, most transformative force in existence, and that no matter how deep it is buried, it is always, inevitably, rising to meet us. The final, lasting impact of the case is the reclamation of the city's identity. Boston is no longer a place of secrets. It is a place of clarity. The investigative resolution of the 1995 cold case had cleared the air, purged the institutional corruption, and empowered the citizenry to stand on the foundation of their own history. Elena Moretti is at peace. The perpetrator is held to the account of the law, and the city, having endured the long, agonizing tunnel of its own failures, has emerged into a brilliance that is finally, at long last, authentic. The record is set straight. The debt of history is paid in full, and the story of Boston, in all its complexity, its beauty, and its terrible, hard-won honesty, continues, shining clearly in the light of the truth, a truth that, now and forever, belongs to the people and to the history that they have finally, collectively, reclaimed. As the dust of the final courtroom proceedings settled into the annals of the Commonwealth, the city of Boston underwent a quiet, tectonic shift in its collective psyche. The resolution of the 1995 cold case had become the definitive demarcation point in the city's timeline, the moment where the veil of 20th-century aristocratic impunity was permanently shredded. For the citizens of Boston, the trial of Julian Moretti was not merely a criminal conviction. It was a societal exorcism. The revelation that their civic infrastructure had been leveraged for a generation to shelter a predator forced a total, uncomfortable audit of every institution that had benefited from his patronage. It was a time of reckoning that extended from the highest halls of the State House to the quiet, cobblestone streets of Beacon Hill, where the very architecture seemed to sigh with the weight of secrets finally surrendered. The institutional legacy of the case, the Moretti Law, and the radical overhaul of the city's forensic infrastructure had solidified into the bedrock of local governance. Every precinct, every forensic unit, and every judicial office now operated under the Moretti Standard, a procedural mandate that treated every unsolved case not as a static historical anomaly, but as a dynamic, actionable obligation. This paradigm shift ensured that the lethargy that had characterized the BPD in the 90s was now functionally impossible. The Forensic Task Force, once an underfunded, overlooked department, had been transformed into the city's most prestigious and technologically capable unit, staffed by investigators who understood that they were not just police officers, but the custodians of the truth for the victims whose voices had been silenced by time. Socially, the city had entered a phase of profound, critical introspection. The Moretti Rule of public-facing ethical audits for any major civic donation or appointment had fundamentally changed the culture of Boston's elite. The era of the unquestionable benefactor was dead. In its place, a culture of rigorous, uncomfortable skepticism had emerged. The citizens of Boston had learned to interrogate the narratives presented to them by the powerful, recognizing that the most dangerous deceptions are often the ones shrouded in the language of charity and public service. This cultural transformation was perhaps the most significant achievement of the entire saga, the creation of a populace that was less inclined to accept the surface-level polish of its leaders and more committed to the demanding, sometimes inconvenient requirements of integrity. For the Vance and Moretti families, the years that followed were defined by a quiet, steady peace. They had moved beyond the trial and the media spectacle, focusing their energy on the foundation that now bore Elena's name. The foundation had become a pillar of the city's social safety net, funding programs for women in crisis and, perhaps more significantly, establishing a statewide scholarship for forensic science students who demonstrated a commitment to truth-based historical investigation. This, for the family, was the most meaningful victory. The creation of a legacy that ensured the next generation of justice would be even more capable, more resilient, and more incorruptible than their own. They were no longer the survivors of a cold case. They were the architects of a future where Elena's tragedy would become a tool for the protection of others. The brownstone on Beacon Hill, now a fully integrated and respected part of the historic district, stood as a quiet, stoic sentinel. The exhibit on the ground floor, chronicling Elena's cultural contributions and the history of the Moretti trial, remained one of the most frequented small-scale educational sites in the city. It served as a reminder that the spaces we inhabit are not just architectural constructs, but historical ones, that every brick and every floorboard carries the potential to store the truth, and that it is the responsibility of those who come after to listen to what the space has to say. The house had been fully reclaimed, its history acknowledged, its darkest secrets exposed, and its narrative corrected, serving as a monument to the endurance of the victim in the face of the perpetrator's attempt to erase her. In the final contemplative evenings of this era, it was common to see people walking the streets of Beacon Hill, stopping in front of the brownstone or strolling over to the park where the memorial stood. There was a sense of collective ownership over the story. It was no longer just the story of a cold case, but the story of the city itself. Boston had learned to integrate its trauma rather than bury it. It had learned that the only way to move forward was to carry the past, not as a weight, but as a map that showed the dangers of apathy, the cost of status, and the absolute, non-negotiable value of the truth. The city had achieved a level of civic maturity that was rarely found in the modern world, a maturity that was born of the recognition that justice is not something you are given, but something you must actively, constantly create. As for the ghost of 1995, it was finally, truly silent. The investigation was closed, the records were settled, and the memory of the crime had been processed into a permanent, constructive component of the city's identity. The investigators, who had walked the long, dark road of the case, had eventually moved into the sunset of their careers, leaving behind a department that was better, sharper, and more honest than the one they had entered. They were the silent, steady guardians of the truth, the ones who had demonstrated that the passage of time is no shield against the reach of justice. Their work was the ultimate testament to the idea that no matter how long the shadows may be, they will eventually dissipate in the face of the truth. The final lesson of the Boston cold case was that the truth is the most powerful substance in the human experience. It is the only thing that cannot be manufactured, bought, or ultimately destroyed. Julian Moretti had spent his entire life building a reality that was a perfect, crystalline lie, only to find that even the most perfect lie has a shelf life. The truth, when it finally arrived, was not just the conclusion of a criminal investigation. It was the fundamental realignment of the reality of an entire community. The case of the 1995 cold case was solved, the archives were closed, and the story had finally, at long last, been brought into the light of a new, unwavering dawn, a dawn that would continue to define the moral character of the city for generations to come. As the sun sets over the historic skyline of Boston, the city continues its steady, forward motion, but it does so with a new kind of awareness. The streets are the same, the buildings are the same, but the spirit of the place is different. It is more honest, more vigilant, and more profoundly committed to the truth. Elena Moretti's story is no longer a footnote, but a foundation, a cornerstone of a city that finally understands that its most precious resource is not its wealth or its status, but the integrity of its own history. The cold case is solved, the tragedy is integrated, and the peace, finally earned, is absolute. The record is set straight, the debt of history is paid in full, and the story of Boston, in all its complexity, its beauty, and its terrible, hard-won honesty, continues, shining clearly in the light of the truth, a truth that, now and forever, belongs to the people and to the history that they have finally, collectively, reclaimed. The past is no longer a prison, but a lighthouse, casting its steady, unblinking beam across the turbulent waters of time, ensuring that the integrity of the journey is as important as the destination. Justice, at last, is not just a dream, but the very foundation upon which the city stands, firm and immovable. The conclusion of the Boston 1995 cold case did not manifest as a singular, triumphant event, but rather as a quiet, systemic crystallization of change that permeated every strata of the Commonwealth. As the decade post-verdict reached its twilight, the city of Boston stood as a different entity, a place where the shadow of the Moretti name had finally evaporated, replaced by a robust, civic-minded culture that viewed history as an active, living record rather than a graveyard of secrets. The investigation that had begun as a desperate attempt to find justice for Elena Moretti had matured into a definitive case study in institutional resilience. The courtroom where Julian Moretti had been sentenced now hosted seminars for the next generation of legal minds, serving as a pedagogical site where the past was analyzed not for its gore, but for its profound, structural lessons in the necessity of forensic vigilance. The architecture of the Boston legal system, once prone to the influence of wealth and social standing, had been hardened against such corruption. The Moretti Law, which had initially been met with skepticism by the old guard, had evolved into a foundational pillar of justice. Its provisions for the systematic, technologically driven re-examination of cold cases ensured that the burden of time was no longer a shield for the guilty. This legislative permanence meant that even as the actors in the 1995 tragedy passed from the scene, the machinery of justice remained, a self-sustaining engine of truth that required no single individual to carry its torch. The city had effectively automated its own integrity, creating a procedural legacy that was immune to the whims of politics or the manipulations of the powerful. Within the social registers of the Boston elite, the long-term impact was a permanent, quiet recalibration of the relationship between status and accountability. The Moretti Rule of radical transparency for all charitable and municipal appointments had become so ingrained in the city's culture that it was no longer viewed as a burden, but as a point of civic pride. Boston had successfully branded itself as the most honest city in the nation, a place where the history of its institutions was treated with the same scrutiny as its current actions. This transition from a culture of reputation to a culture of record-keeping had not only purged the toxic elements of the previous generation but had attracted a new wave of civic leaders, individuals who thrived in a climate of openness and who viewed public service as a role defined by transparency rather than influence. For the Vance and Moretti families, the years that followed were marked by a steady, unremarkable grace. The initial, sharp edges of their trauma had been sanded down by the passage of time and the quiet satisfaction of seeing justice fully served. They had long since stepped away from the spotlight, living their lives in the comfort of their own privacy, but their legacy remained present in the city's social fabric. The foundation they had established had grown into an essential, permanent component of the Commonwealth's social safety net. It had evolved to address not just the immediate crisis of domestic violence, but the systemic causes, funding research and prevention programs that were being replicated in states across the country. They had turned the story of Elena from an ending into a process of protection, of education, and of restoration. The brownstone on Beacon Hill, now a fully integrated and respected historic landmark, stood as a living classroom. Its history, once a dark, guarded secret, was now a celebrated, if somber, part of the city's heritage. The exhibit on its ground floor continued to attract students and history buffs, all looking to understand how the architecture of a house could eventually reveal the architecture of a crime. The house had been fully reclaimed, not by being hidden, but by being opened up. Its resilience, its ability to transition from a place of murder to a place of education, was a metaphor for the city itself. Boston had learned that the only way to deal with its history was to integrate it, to take the dark, uncomfortable pieces of its past and fit them into the larger, more coherent narrative of its own maturity. In the final, contemplative hours of this era, walking through the streets of Beacon Hill, one could feel the profound change in the city's spirit. The atmosphere was lighter, the expectations higher, and the civic consciousness more attuned to the reality beneath the surface. The city had learned to look at its own past without fear, to see the flaws and the failures not as secrets to be buried, but as lessons to be mastered. It was a mature, honest city, a city that had weathered the storm of its own dark history and had come out the other side with a refined, clear-eyed understanding of the value of justice. The resolution of the 1995 case had provided the framework, but the city's own collective resolve had built the reality. As for the ghost of 1995, it was finally, truly silent. The investigation was closed, the archives were finalized, and the story of the murder of Elena Moretti had been processed into a permanent, constructive component of the city's identity. The investigators, who had walked the long, dark road of the case, had eventually moved into the sunset of their careers, leaving behind a department that was better, sharper, and more honest than the one they had entered. They were the silent, steady guardians of the truth, the ones who had demonstrated that the passage of time is no shield against the reach of justice. Their work was the ultimate testament to the idea that no matter how long the shadows may be, they will eventually dissipate in the face of the truth. The final lesson of the Boston Cold Case was that the truth is the most powerful substance in the human experience. It is the only thing that cannot be manufactured, bought, or ultimately destroyed. Julian Moretti had spent his entire life building a reality that was a perfect, crystalline lie, only to find that even the most perfect lie has a shelf life. The truth, when it finally arrived, was not just the conclusion of a criminal investigation. It was the fundamental realignment of the reality of an entire community. The case of the 1995 cold case was solved, the archives were closed, and the story had finally, at long last, been brought into the light of a new, unwavering dawn, a dawn that would continue to define the moral character of the city for generations to come. As the sun sets over the historic skyline of Boston, the city continues its steady, forward motion, but it does so with a new kind of awareness. The streets are the same, the buildings are the same, but the spirit of the place is different. It is more honest, more vigilant, and more profoundly committed to the truth. Elena Moretti's story is no longer a footnote, but a foundation, a cornerstone of a city that finally understands that its most precious resource is not its wealth or its status, but the integrity of its own history. The cold case is solved, the tragedy is integrated, and the peace, finally earned, is absolute. The record is set straight, the debt of history is paid in full, and the story of Boston, in all its complexity, its beauty, and its terrible, hard-won honesty, continues, shining clearly in the light of the truth. The ghost of 1995 is gone, and the future, built upon the hard-won clarity of the past, is finally, and for the first time, truly open to the brilliance of an honest day. The conclusion of the Boston 1995 cold case did not manifest as a singular, triumphant event, but rather as a quiet, systemic crystallization of change that permeated every strata of the Commonwealth. As the decade post-verdict reached its twilight, the city of Boston stood as a different entity, a place where the shadow of the Moretti name had finally evaporated, replaced by a robust, civic-minded culture that viewed history as an active, living record rather than a graveyard of secrets. The investigation that had begun as a desperate attempt to find justice for Elena Moretti had matured into a definitive case study in institutional resilience. The courtroom where Julian Moretti had been sentenced now hosted seminars for the next generation of legal minds, serving as a pedagogical site where the past was analyzed not for its gore, but for its profound, structural lessons in the necessity of forensic vigilance. The architecture of the Boston legal system, once prone to the influence of wealth and social standing, had been hardened against such corruption. The Moretti Law, which had initially been met with skepticism by the old guard, had evolved into a foundational pillar of justice. Its provisions for the systematic, technologically driven re-examination of cold cases ensured that the burden of time was no longer a shield for the guilty. This legislative permanence meant that, even as the actors in the 1995 tragedy passed from the scene, the machinery of justice remained, a self-sustaining engine of truth that required no single individual to carry its torch. The city had effectively automated its own integrity, creating a procedural legacy that was immune to the whims of politics or the manipulations of the powerful. Within the social registers of the Boston elite, the long-term impact was a permanent, quiet recalibration of the relationship between status and accountability. The Moretti Rule of radical transparency for all charitable and municipal appointments had become so ingrained in the city's culture that it was no longer viewed as a burden, but as a point of civic pride. Boston had successfully branded itself as the most honest city in the nation, a place where the history of its institutions was treated with the same scrutiny as its current actions. This transition from a culture of reputation to a culture of record-keeping had not only purged the toxic elements of the previous generation but had attracted a new wave of civic leaders, individuals who thrived in a climate of openness and who viewed public service as a role defined by transparency rather than influence. For the Vance and Moretti families, the years that followed were marked by a steady, unremarkable grace. The initial, sharp edges of their trauma had been sanded down by the passage of time and the quiet satisfaction of seeing justice fully served. They had long since stepped away from the spotlight, living their lives in the comfort of their own privacy, but their legacy remained present in the city's social fabric. The foundation they had established had grown into an essential, permanent component of the Commonwealth's social safety net. It had evolved to address not just the immediate crisis of domestic violence, but the systemic causes, funding research and prevention programs that were being replicated in states across the country. They had turned the story of Elena from an ending into a process of protection, of education, and of restoration. The brownstone on Beacon Hill, now a fully integrated and respected historic landmark, stood as a living classroom. Its history, once a dark, guarded secret, was now a celebrated, if somber, part of the city's heritage. The exhibit on its ground floor continued to attract students and history buffs, all looking to understand how the architecture of a house could eventually reveal the architecture of a crime. The house had been fully reclaimed, not by being hidden, but by being opened up. Its resilience, its ability to transition from a place of murder to a place of education, was a metaphor for the city itself. Boston had learned that the only way to deal with its history was to integrate it, to take the dark, uncomfortable pieces of its past and fit them into the larger, more coherent narrative of its own maturity. In the final, contemplative hours of this era, walking through the streets of Beacon Hill, one could feel the profound change in the city's spirit. The atmosphere was lighter, the expectations higher, and the civic consciousness more attuned to the reality beneath the surface. The city had learned to look at its own past without fear, to see the flaws and the failures not as secrets to be buried, but as lessons to be mastered. It was a mature, honest city, a city that had weathered the storm of its own dark history and had come out the other side with a refined, clear-eyed understanding of the value of justice. The resolution of the 1995 case had provided the framework, but the city's own collective resolve had built the reality. As for the ghost of 1995, it was finally, truly silent. The investigation was closed, the archives were finalized, and the story of the murder of Elena Moretti had been processed into a permanent, constructive component of the city's identity. The investigators, who had walked the long, dark road of the case, had eventually moved into the sunset of their careers, leaving behind a department that was better, sharper, and more honest than the one they had entered. They were the silent, steady guardians of the truth, the ones who had demonstrated that the passage of time is no shield against the reach of justice. Their work was the ultimate testament to the idea that no matter how long the shadows may be, they will eventually dissipate in the face of the truth. The final lesson of the Boston Cold Case was that the truth is the most powerful substance in the human experience. It is the only thing that cannot be manufactured, bought, or ultimately destroyed. Julian Moretti had spent his entire life building a reality that was a perfect, crystalline lie, only to find that even the most perfect lie has a shelf life. The truth, when it finally arrived, was not just the conclusion of a criminal investigation. It was the fundamental realignment of the reality of an entire community. The case of the 1995 cold case was solved, the archives were closed, and the story had finally, at long last, been brought into the light of a new, unwavering dawn, a dawn that would continue to define the moral character of the city for generations to come. As the sun sets over the historic skyline of Boston, the city continues its steady, forward motion, but it does so with a new kind of awareness. The streets are the same, the buildings are the same, but the spirit of the place is different. It is more honest, more vigilant, and more profoundly committed to the truth.